Everybody, how you guys doing? Thank you for joining me. I have two highly esteemed guests on the channel, good friends of mine, Erick Ybarra, Craig Truglia. Thank you guys both for coming on to talk about this topic regarding the letters of Popes Agatho and Hadrian. Both of you guys are authors of books about the papacy. The links for both of their channels and their books are in the description. Please check them out. Two amazing books on the papacy, one way or the other. And I'm really excited for this. Thank you guys. Thanks to both of you for doing it on my channel, letting me moderate. I really appreciate that.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. I just got to say, did I miss Saint Cyril or Saint Ephraim? Because I saw Saint Severus in the opening, and I saw Jacob of Sarug and a bunch of other people, but I didn't see Cyril or Ephraim.
No, they were both there.
They were there. I knew it had to be. I just missed it.
Yeah.
My comment is that Ybarra ripped off my hat.
Oh, look at that. Yeah, it's in the reverse today.
It's
well, I don't know if I want to go without a hat.
This is the reason Theology Reunion, at least we brought the hat. So we got a hat here. Open invitation to Mike Lofton. Let's do this thing.
Absolutely.
Greg, it's funny you mentioned that. We just did a show on Erick's channel like a week or so ago. Another reunion nostalgia thing with Elijah Yassi and William Albrecht. We were all there. So it's funny. These are happening more and more. And again, this is really exciting. I don't have kind of a direction for the show planned because you guys are the experts on the topic, on the centuries. As you guys both know, it's non-applicable to me. So I want to let you guys kind of have a normal discussion or conversation, like two people sitting having a cup of coffee, something like that, So however you guys would want to start. But before we do, I want to point out something. Elijah Yassi, the guy, I think we share a sense of humor. While the prayer is happening, I picked that prayer in the intro because it's a very beautiful prayer. I can send you guys a translation. But look what he says in the comments. He goes, perfect music for a Latin and Greek. And then he goes,
I was just going to say, you better send me a translation.
Absolutely. He goes, pretty sure this chant has RC and EOS in condemnations. It does not.
It's
that would be something, wouldn't it?
The Lion's Den selling out. They're branching out in topics they used to not branch out in to try to increase the subscriber base.
Exactly. I'm going.
And then we're gonna have videos of Subdeacon Daniel, like Subdeacon Daniel visits based Baptist church, and it's like the thumbnails you doing this, and then so everyone's going, wait, is he converting to be a Baptist? And then you visit an Nestorian church, like, wait, is he becoming a Nestorian? And you just get more and more subscribers.
All right. Okay, let's do it. Let's get in it. So Pope Agatho, he wrote a letter in Constantinople 680, right? He wrote a letter to the Synod. And then Pope Hadrian does the same thing in Nicaea 787. So we're going to talk about those two letters and their roles in those synods and what the implications are. Is that correct? Is that the correct premise?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like I said, whatever he'd like, whatever Craig wants to talk about. I started off last week with a small, blog post on the issue of statues. I know that was a long time ago. I didn't see your video up on that anymore, so I wasn't sure you still held to that claim. But if you wanted to talk about that, I'm game for that.
It's in a YouTube short, so it's
Okay.
like 15 seconds of content.
Yeah. Or anything I brought up in the last show. I didn't come with a lot of preparation.
Well, I will give maybe just an overall, like, impartial, like, what these letters are, right?
Okay.
So people are aware when we see like letter of Saint Pope Agatho, letter of Pope Adrian. These are not quite like a personal letter, right? To make it really simple, like when we have letters of popes and these bishops, they're not like a private letter you receive in the mail from grandma on your birthday or something like that, right? They're generally synodical statements, and they're signed by the primate of the synod, right? So the letter of Pope Agatho was really actually like the conciliar decree of Rome 680, which is then sent to the Council of Constantinople the next year. Similarly, the letter of Pope Adrian is the synodical statement of the Synod of Rome in 785, and then sent to Nicaea too in 787. So if they have a tone of authority, they have a tone of having settled things, well, at least without going, well, what are the larger ramifications of this? Of course they will, because they're synodical decrees. This is what is expected to be believed in that synod. And so the question now becomes, why do, laymen like Erick and I, or people watching this, like mostly laymen, though Erick and I, I'm sure, get contacted by more than a few priests these days that are following these topics. Why do people care about these synodical decrees? Well, it's because these decrees are sent to ecumenical councils to give the teaching, and in this instance, the teaching of Rome, right? This is what the Church of Rome teaches. For us to be down at this council, you must accept this. And so then it becomes relevant. Well, what are the contents of these documents, in as much that the councils receive these documents as part of their inheritance, as part of the teaching of the council, and as part of Rome's participation in this council, which is necessary for the council to be rightly ecumenical. And so I would say with that context then comes, all right, how does one interpret these letters, and what do these letters actually say? I'm not sure, Erick, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds good.
Yeah, so it's so that being said, it's another issue, and I want to apologize in advance. I am in, so people aren't aware, I'm in Cambodia. So if I disappear or things get worse than usual with my connection, just so you're aware, I'm in Cambodia right now doing this show. And so the Council of Constantinople III and the Council of Nicaea II, and the letters they receive they're important to us following apologetics for our respective church communions, really for different reasons. People don't think of them like that. People think of them as proof text, like in a quote mine. This says this says that, therefore this. But to really understand what they say, we have to understand that they are addressing different things and making different claims. And so it'll probably be useful to speak about one issue at a time, and to then talk about the potential disagreements in these issues and things to that effect. So maybe just to break the ice, I'll just put it very plainly. We'll just start in sequential order. The letter of St. Agatho, right? The Rome 680's decree sent to Constantinople III, the Ecumenical Council. Why do people care? Here's why they should care, by the way. It's got a very good floregium on the issue of diotheletism, right? And that is, the translation from Cambridge doesn't even have any of the papal stuff. It has just the diathelite issues in it. And so that's very, very important. And regrettably, that's something that people are not as concerned about. Their interaction tends to be with a translation by an Anglican scholar named Henry Percival. And so what people zero in on is, does the letter of St. Agatho teach papal infallibility, or does it not? I mean, would you say that's really, Erick, what people generally are interested in when we talk about this letter?
Yeah, generally speaking, in the apologetic sphere, when you say Agatho's letter, that's usually what comes up. Um, I should say here, just for a brief moment, that uh, even though I do make it a point of interest, um, it's good to remind people, like you just did, that the primary intention and context has little to do with the papacy, and so we're really just we're looking at something that is not specifically try you know I for example, would I say that the epistle of Agatho teaches papal infallibility? I would actually say no, because it's just not the issue. Agatho doesn't really think he's scoring any points when he talks about Peter, Roman C. Perhaps just to say that what he says has credibility, but the primary issue here is he wants the Byzantines to submit to the Roman view on Christ. So yeah, and same thing with Hadrian, on the issue of images.
And yeah,
Or
it's
yeah, there's other stuff to it, but you know what I'm saying.
yeah, the larger thing would be whether or not these letters say things in passing that reveal the mind of the church on a given topic, right?
That's right.
So it's not that, unlike maybe what some people believe, Pope Agatho or Pope Hadrian submit papal infallibility or papal supremacy up for vote. The church gives a vote, they accepted it. That would be an inappropriate way of looking at the topic, but from any perspective. The question would be, is this a letter that has authority, which maybe we should discuss what makes something the council authoritative or not. Is this something that has authority, and is the way it is stated in passing, is that relevant? Now, I would say both of us are going to say yes, but that's something actually people don't take for granted. Feel free to interrupt, but in your video, it's very interesting because you bring up, I'm forgetting which, was it Montanaro? I think it was Cardinal Montanaro brings it up during the Council of Florence, where they're arguing over Agatho's letter. And I believe it was Bessarion says, well, what do you have canonically that shows these papal doctrines? And Montanaro's reply is, let me quote it actually, because it's an important quote. Let's see. He says that the definitions and canons of councils are the result of the study of the writings of the fathers and the letters quoted in the council, where therefore have at least equal authority with the canons. If we were to take that statement in an OCD literalistic sense, in some sense, it means it's more authoritative than the canons, because he says at least. I don't think he actually means that if I had to interpret that passage out of context, but I think we could agree what he's saying is we can't take something just because it's a letter or a passing statement in a letter and say, well, it has no relevance, because what is stated in the council informs the conciliar decree and the canons. And so thereby it shares authority with these things. Now, this is not a peculiar idea of Montanaro, because this is something that comes up in the 12th paragraph of the conciliar tome of the Council of Constantinople, 1351. This is part of the Orthodox tradition. Mm-hmm. This has been called by Father Richard Price conciliar fundamentalism. It's a pejorative. It somewhat makes it simple to understand for Americans and Western thinkers that, wow, they're saying that even the passing statements in the council are important, like what we just heard Montanaro say. But I think, and this is a terminology I have coined because I think it's more useful and accurate, and ironically, much more consistent what we just heard from Montanaro, is the church historically has been contextualist, meaning it's not that everything stated in the ecumenical council is true, because it quotes Nestorius, let's say, in the Council of Ephesus. Obviously not in endorsing what Nestorius says, actually for much the opposite. Just like the Bible quotes Satan speaking to Jesus or speaking to God, I don't know which person, the Holy Trinity, in the book of Job. And obviously we're not saying what Satan is saying is true. In fact, Satan is proved wrong in both those examples. But contextually speaking, we could see where these false statements or passing statements fit into the larger picture, right? Other than being OCD, if you're just a normal human being reading this, you would understand what the statements from Satan in the Bible, how they fit into a larger teaching. And in the ecumenical councils, where, let's say, quoting Nestorius fits into condemning Nestorius. Or let's now get to Agatho's letter, and quoting Agatho's letter and him making passing statements about the papacy, where that would fit in and showing how the people there understood the papacy. And if they understood the papacy wrong, or the ecclesiology of the church wrong, even if that was not the primary point at issue, on what basis are those fathers reliable for giving a conciliar decree? Right? We would not trust a peer review process for an academic article if the peer reviewers, didn't know what they're doing, right? Would you trust a science journal from people that were geocentrist? Maybe the article they'll publish will be accurate, but they're really wrong in this other crucial scientific issue. And before people freak out, by the theory of relativity, it's hard to know what's the center of the universe because everything's relative. But whatever, right? You get the point. The subdeacon's rolling his eyes. I don't know.
No, I was talking to somebody. Sorry.
Okay. So that being said, it's the conciliar fathers, to be reliable in a normal way, without thinking of this in a Montanist way, where only when they issue a decree or canon are they magically beam down the ability to speak authoritatively, but only in that one instance. To not look at this normally and go, well, obviously their decrees and canons are reliable because they are reliable in teaching in a consensus-based setting in a council, that then we could see the relevance of these statements. I'll say one more thing, and then Eric, maybe you give your perspective on this. But for example, Dositheus II of Jerusalem, a lot of people know who he is because he wrote the Confession of Dositheus. In his book, De Dodeca Biblias, he also gives the conciliar fundamentalist teaching, but he doesn't call it that, of course. That terminology didn't exist. And he gives that teaching as the basis to say that the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople has by rights the title ecumenical patriarch, because he says in the councils, they're calling him ecumenical patriarch. So obviously, how are these fathers reliable if they don't understand something that basic correctly, right? And so that same logic could and must be applied to a letter like Agatho's, a letter like Hadrian's, if, again, we're reading these like historians. And at this juncture, I just have to own the label. I'm now published a few times in peer-reviewed journals in history. Maybe I'm not a great historian, but I do work in history. I'm a historian. And so looking at this as a historian, and not philosophically, I'm not a theologian and those different things, but as a historian, that's how we determine what did the people there actually believe, what were they actually trying to do. That's how we would interpret historical sources. And so I see that in Montenero, I see that in Dositheus, I see that in an Orthodox council. So I see this as both intellectually and from my communion's vantage point, even dogmatically reliable, because this is what's actually, unlike what maybe people will hear from apologists, but you actually see in the authorities of the church and in the actual conciliar statements of my church. So I'll just leave that there. And I know if you want to add anything, Eric.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest. But, I try my best to say that everything in an ecumenical council has to be assented to. But I'm just in my experience as a Catholic, going through ecumenical councils. You know, our theologians, you know, ever since, you know, probably the Protestant Reformation, because that's really when Protestants put the Catholics to the fire when it came to continuity. In many ways, Catholic theologians and scholars in that era were not as sharp due to how the Lutherans and the Calvinists were trying to prove that the Church of the Fathers and the church, the late medieval church, were not the same thing. And so the Lutheran the patristic scholars, you know, they really put the fire to the feet of Catholics. And I noticed that one of the results of that was that Catholics they felt forced to admit that there is a level of fallibility to ecumenical councils because of certain things that are just either reversed or not believed anymore, or contradict current beliefs, whatever it is. And so I think that, you know, conciliar fundamentalism, as Richard Price calls it, I'm not sure that I could really defend that view. But what I can say is that it seems that that is the majority view of the actual bishops at the seven ecumenical councils. I think there are some exceptions, but you know, then that's not the overwhelming majority. So I think that, yeah, we should treat these letters as part of the council, especially because, like Agatho's letter and Hadrian's letter, they both receive multiple episcopal acclamations. You know, each bishop was supposed to get up and give a verbal statement that he agreed with the bilingual recitation of the letter. So it has to be part of the bloodstream of the council, I think. So.
And yeah, that's fairly common in the sessions of councils, because the point of the sessions was to conduct authoritative business. When you read the minutes, you find out, generally speaking, a lot happens in between sessions, but it's kind of unofficial. And so, right, there's no votes. It doesn't really count per se. And this is where I have to say I'm admittedly ignorant of the exact proceedings because they're not published, the Council of Florence, because it seems like a lot happens between the sessions, and the actual procedure of the council was very unlike the earlier councils. And same, by the way, if people are interested in modern Orthodox topics, same with the Council of Crete, for example, in 2016. And so from someone who's looking at this historically, you're like, all right, well, then what's the exact ecclesiastical procedure in this council, being that it's so different? And that's where we just need more published to really fully understand those things. But let's now jump into, I would say, the contents of Agatho's letter. And maybe I'll just speak very broadly. Whether in passing, the document at least explicitly teaches papal infallibility. And I'm going to put forward the idea that in reality, what Agatho literally says, what he explicitly says, is neither what the Orthodox or the Roman Catholics believe today. And I'm going to submit to the audience and to Erick and Subdeacon Daniel here, neither what actually Agatho thought, if we understood what he was actually trying to convey in a high context sort of language. And so if we see at least what some of these statements are, we'll be getting to some of the textual disagreements, very broadly speaking, because I affirm the authority of the Latin as stated. Okay, so I do think the Latin accurately conveys what Agatho really wrote. And so I don't believe that in every jot and tittle that's true in the Greek and what was received in the council, and we can discuss that. But let's just stick with what Agatho really wrote, and thereby what he himself was trying to convey, because he died before the council was over. He speaks of the Church of Rome in some context being preserved without error. All right. So inerrancy. Now, when we speak of infallibility, generally speaking, people are presuming upon a much more specific definition and application of the idea of being preserved from error. when a pope teaches faith and morals ex cathedra to the whole church, something to that effect. But we don't see that definition given in passing, because again, like Erick said, wasn't like he was setting out to do. We're seeing what he's saying in passing. We don't see that exact definition or thought conveyed in Agatho's letter. He just says, without error. So this already puts all of us here, Erick and I, interested audience members reading it. It already puts all of us here in the position that now we have to do the hard work of interpretation, because we already know there's no way he meant categorically there's no error of any sort of the Pope. Not even silly things like, could a Pope get a math problem wrong? I mean, that's an error. But things of different serious nature. Could a Pope enter into communion with the wrong person? I mean, in apologetic debates, that's seen as unimportant because it's not dogmatic. But in the life of the church, of course, that's important. Could the Pope make a wrong pastoral judgment call? There's stuff in recent memory, but there's stuff in ancient memory as well that just so it's not, not something that's divisive, because I don't like bringing up the modern stuff in Roman Catholicism. We have enough of our own dirty laundry in Orthodoxy where I don't see it very useful. But in the 3rd century, we had, Pope Callistus allowing divorced priests, right? And stuff like that. It's meaning that you could ordain someone who is divorced. I'm not making a positive claim that he was allowing for divorce. And this is something the ecumenical patriarch, by the way, does today. So we can say that's a wrong judgment call. That's an error. But that is not what people mean by papal infallibility. Then there's issues like, well, then could popes make errors in private interpretations or in letters that are not ex cathedra? And we could argue whether something's ex cathedra or not, or whether something's even faith and morals or not. So what's the point of this long aside? It's to show no one is taking, and I don't think Agatho is taking without error to mean categorically without error, because that would be transparently not possible by any way. I mean, the Pope, by Pope Vitalian preceding him, entered into communion with the monothelites. So obviously that was an error. Vitalian is a saint in the Roman Catholic Communion. As soon as he was able to right the ship, and the Pope Emperor Constantine IV, I think it was, he's a saint in the Orthodox Communion, was a little more amenable to the diathlete position. Pope Vitalius, if I remember right, was now not so amenable to at least being in communion with monothelites. But the point is, Agatho had been aware of these things. It's not, he was alive at the time. He was I believe, a deacon at that time and would have been in the know of all these matters. And so we have to admit to ourselves, we got to do the work of interpretation, because no one believes that what is stated is meant to be taken absolutely literally. Now, the question is, what interpretation is appropriate? This is now where I think Erick and I are going to have more major disagreements, unless there's already disagreement already. I don't know if we're on the same page so far, Erick.
No, everything so far I'm tracking with.
All right, great. So, we'll keep going, and Erick will interject if there's, now we're getting to a disjunction. So the question now is, by inerrancy, is Pope Agatho talking about, as Roman Catholics understand, say, infallibility, or let's lessen the claim, is at least consistent with what we know papal infallibility today, so that then, even if we didn't ascribe to a dogmatic idea like doctrinal development, that is like, well, he's just talking about an aspect of it in passing, so at least that's credible that the larger doctrine existed, or something to that effect. Now, my honest understanding of the historical evidence of the letter is that the teaching on inerrancy is fairly common in the 7th century as an honorific. Now, this is something that during Florence was the actual response of the Orthodox delegation, and it's stuff everyone's heard from apologetics in debates, so it's not the first time they've ever heard such a thing. But it's something that I think makes sense of the eternal logic of the passage, and makes sense with how ultimately, I'm going to argue, the Greeks rendered a certain passage so as to prevent the interpretation from being anything other than that. Now, I think what people are not aware of is that there are other infallibility statements which people meant as honorifics. There's a question mark. Honorific would be a statement that is very like a very kind thing to say about someone, like in the Bible, most excellent Theophilus, right? You give him a title that's very kind. Does it really mean he's the most excellent person in the whole world? I mean, that's what most excellent means. It means most excellent. And we understand that, no, it's a title.
So and His Holiness. So
yeah, it's, we
pious,
call him, Nestorius was called His Holiness. In the process of deposing him until he's deposed, because they didn't really think he was holy. That was his title. So we don't speak like that in America or in the West in the modern day. So people find it strange, but it's very common back then. And so I could read in more detail if people want the details, but so as not to bore people, I'll just say it in passing. And if Erick's like, I want more details, I will give more details. But we have statements like from Pope Leo to the Byzantine emperor. I think the emperor was named Anastasius, if I remember right. But no, it was another emperor, Leo. I'm getting their names wrong at this point. I have none of my books here. But long story short is like Pope Leo told the Roman emperor in a letter that, the Holy Spirit has taught you and you will not make any error in the faith. And then he goes on the rest of the letter to tell him, don't do this wrong, don't do that wrong. So we know he didn't really mean that, right? Because the emperor couldn't make any errors. Then why is Pope Leo telling him, here's what not to screw up, right? But so we understand this is clearly an honorific. Now, closer to the 7th century, though, we have a effusive letter from Pope Cyrus of Alexandria. He's not a pope for the Oriental Orthodox Communion. He was a Pope Alexandria for the Eastern Orthodox or Catholic communions. But he's, by all of our accounts, well, maybe not the Oriental Orthodox account, but anyway, he was a heretic according to my communion. And he writes a letter to the Bishop of Constantinople, I believe Sergius, and he calls him Father of Fathers. I think patriarch. Well, just like Father of Fathers. He says the Holy. He's a God-taught self. The Holy Spirit guides his words. He writes without any error. So it's again an infallibility statement, but not the only one we read in that century. Even Saint Agatho himself writes of Emperor Constantine that the letter he wrote is without error, and he's God taught. Maybe not without error. I'm gonna have to look at the letter, but he says he's God taught. I think he says without error. And so we could see this is a way people would address one another and saying what I'm teaching is correct or what my predecessor taught was correct. That doesn't mean it can't be taken in this larger categorical sense, but I think it would have to be demonstrated that there's a context where it is, because we just named several contexts where clearly it can't be. And so that being said, in the Latin, where everything that we're aware of today on both sides is intact and I think is reliable in the Latin, all these statements are there. And then so the question would be whether St. Agatho would have intended to mean them in a sense consistent with the Roman Catholic doctrine, which Erick and I differ on. And my reading as a historian is no, without the demonstration that we have infallibility statements that are ever meant in that larger sense, because we have statements that are not. And so I'd be reading statement consistently with that. But I would add one more thing to this equation, which is the meat of my article, which inspired Erick's video. And Erick fairly said that Craig poses the question. He doesn't really say that the statement from Agatho is interpolated, because actually the answer in my article is no, it's not. It's authentic. So the question is, why is it absent from the most reliable Greek manuscripts? And this is where I argue gives us the valid interpretation of the passage, because it gives us the mind of the conciliar fathers, which is this, that when the statement is made about popes in the past, right? Erick was parsing the Greek, and he says, well, this talk about being preserved from error in the past. Because Pope Honorius was anathematized by the council said, well, we can't, leave the statement as is because it's going to contradict conciliar business. So we're going to excise the statement, which, again, things like this happen in ecumenical councils. It doesn't show even like they were banging their chest offended. How dare you say such a thing? It was, they understood this could be confusing. We're going to remove this passage. Now, there's other statements which are similarly consistent, or even, I'd say, rightfully from a grammatical sense, could be interpreted just like the excised passage. Here is the difference. The difference is, due to the vagaries of grammar, the issue is those passages could be legitimately interpreted in a different sense. Here is an example. The letter ends, towards the ending, St. Agatho writes that the Holy Mother of the Empire must be preserved from every error. And so here we see the Mother Church being an application to the Universal Church, where it at least seems earlier that it's the Church of Rome that is maybe given the title. But again, due to grammar, it could be taken either way. It's intentionally vague, I believe. And so he makes this statement that, that Mother Church must be preserved from error. So now we know, like, all right, if the Mother Church has no error, but it must be preserved from error, we're in the business of interpretation now. There's a sense where the Mother Church has error. But he's speaking the Universal Church. And he talks about keeping the Orthodox faith immaculate by the help of St. Peter. And this church, I think, is an accurate translation. If you look at the Latin, it's a little less clear, but read consistently with the whole paragraph. Percival's translation, and I think Erick's translation, the Greek concurs to this Latin translation, is that the Church of Rome is being mentioned in this parenthetical statement. Then what follows is that without error, this will be preserved and taught by the bishops, and the passage continues. So the question now is the Church of Rome, which, presuming that is the right way of saying, instead of the church, it's this church, is that what's preserved from error, or is it the Orthodox faith that's preserved from error? Now, I argue is the Orthodox faith that's preserved by error, because the reference to the Roman Church is in a parenthetical statement, commas. You could see this in the Latin, in Migne Nomanzi. You can see this in the Greek. You could see this in Erick's translation. You can see this in Percival's translation. There's a parenthetical statement. Grammatically, one has every justification to read the faith as what's preserved from error. For those who are really curious, both the Greek and the Latin, the nouns for church and for faith are both female nouns, feminine nouns. And so either could be joined to without error, due to, if we're going to the gender of the verbiage. But this is now precisely my point, which is, in the present tense, Agatho is exercising precisely this function, because he's not Honorius, he's not being anathematized. This is something that would not be offensive to the council. It would not contradict conciliar business. Furthermore, even, I say, highly partisan Roman Catholic translators, my favorite, John Calarafi, obviously, interpret it as the faith that's preserved without error. You could read that in Scott Butler's and John Calarafi's Keys of the Christian World. So even if Calarafi's wrong, and there is another way to interpret this, I don't think he's wrong. I concur with his interpretation. It's my interpretation. You can interpret Erick's translation the same way. But the fact there's two interpretations permits the understanding, consistent with the rest of Agatho's letter, of interpreting the letter not in the sense that would contradict the conciliar business. Unlike the earlier passage, which is excised from the Greek, because it would have not allowed differing interpretations on that point. And so because there is this parenthetical statement in the second passage, there's no reason for excision. And so what I've been saying for years, talking about Agatho, is St. Agatho is intentionally vague. And so that way, from the Latin perspective, they could give a very strong authoritative teaching, a decree for their patriarchate, and they could send that very authoritative, really demanding decree to the Council of Constantinople saying, you must accept this, right? But the conciliar business Constantinople, due to the intentional vagaries in the language, doesn't have to take what's stated there as something that then could overturn conciliar business, or in a sense, inconsistent with how they were used to using honorifics. I would argue that St. Agatho was intentionally writing really, really no different than Cyrus Alexandria and other guys at the time. And so this is what I refer to in Twitter. It's so much better when we have more than 140 characters too. I would say maybe the crucial error, and Erick could disagree with this, but the crucial error, if we were to take what Erick stated in his recent video as the be-all end-all of his thoughts on this matter, because the fact that there's not a singular interpretation of this passage precisely fits why the council did what they did in excising the earlier passage. It's consistent with all the conciliar business. And so as the historian, the interpretation that makes sense of all the extant data, being that that's all we have, we don't want to postulate documents that don't exist, which is why so many don't like the Q hypothesis and things like that, the synoptics, with other Christian studies. That is the most workable interpretation. Actually, it is considered a rule in text criticism, by the way, is that the strongest interpretation of a disputed text is one that can make sense of all of the extant documents when we do text criticism. And so what I'm posing here is my attempt to follow those pretty much procedural rules on doing text criticism. Sorry to bore you guys, but that's why it's honorific. There you go. You just had your 3-word answer. But that is the thought process that goes behind justifying that conclusion. So let's give Erick some time to respond, because that's essentially my response to at least the St. Agatho portion of his video.
For sure. Let me just throw in a real quick the point on Cyrus of Alexandria, since that was a curious point. You know, what does the OO think about him? We actually agree with you guys. We call him the Antichrist, son of Satan. So
poor guy. He's trying to get along with everyone. It doesn't work out.
Go ahead, Erick.
No, subdeacon. Do they literally mean it? Like he's a spawn of Satan?
No.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
It's a de-honorific.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that there's obviously honorifics, right? We can't deny the existence of honorifics. And, you know, Catholic apologists have been guilty of jumping to say that something corresponds to reality, which is an honorific. I mean, and the proof of that is we just go through other very either self-aggrandizing or other statements with reference to other people who are in power and authority, which can't be literal, you know. So yeah, we scholarship today is all they are well aware of that, you know. But there are some key features that I think distinguish an honorific from something that does correspond to reality, or something that is an honorific that also corresponds to reality. You know, so for example, like some of the statements about the Virgin Mary, for example, and her holiness, you know, or Christ and his power. You know, these are honorifics, perhaps, but they are meant to correspond to reality. You know, the church, angels, the earth, you know, some things that they're honorifics, but they correspond to some reality, even if the reality is in truth defined in some lesser, you know, way. So when I read Agatho's letter, I don't see Vatican I, Pastor Ternus, chapter 4, ex cathedra, right? But what I do see is I see that Agatho is saying that our Lord Jesus Christ did something when he stood in the flesh in front of Peter. You know, he actually did something, and he commissioned him to feed the flock, shepherd the church, and he promised him that his faith would not fail, and that those things are not just realities bound up in Peter's life, but that are meant to be according to promise. That's the other feature. When Agatho refers to the Petrine commission as a promise, he says, according to the divine promise. Now we're getting into something a little bit more real, right? Because that's literally a promise. So can we apply promise to an unreal honorific? Yes, it has happened. It's applied to the empire. It's applied to other bishops. It's applied to, but there's a key distinction that I think plays a role when we're reading texts that distinguish honorific that's unreal versus honorific that's real. For example, when we say that, when you see conciliar acclamations that the Church of God will not be prevailed against by the gates of hell, most Catholics and Orthodox are going to say that that's real, right? But in the same session or a session or two prior or after, you'll see something like that said about the empire, and well, wait a minute, if it's going to be an empty honorific, or perhaps, a hopeful honorific of some sort in one text, maybe it's a hopeful honorific for the church. I think that it depends on the text. I think it depends on the text. So in Agatho's letter, what I see him doing is he's making a claim about what Jesus did as recorded in the Gospels with Peter, and that this has long-lasting, and I should say everlasting, implications for the government of the church. So does he say the Pope is always going to be infallible? Some would say that. Some would come out with that interpretation. But I would say he's at least saying that St. Peter's successor inherits certain invested prerogatives that Christ invested in Peter. And because of a promise given to Peter that will last until the consummation, unto the end, that has actual real implications for the government of the church. Whether that means that we can have a heretical pope, a deposed pope, that's a question for another room. But in the room of just my reading of Agatho's letter, it does seem to me that he's saying that there's been a divine investiture in the Apostle Peter, and that has significance not just for Peter's life and the life of the few decades that he was alive after Pentecost, or what he was traditionally crucified in 56? I can't remember, but you get the point.
66, but yeah.
Yes. So Agatho thinks that he is in a long line of patronological configuration that's guided and animated by divine promise, and it does relate. He does relate it to the Roman Church's contribution to the health of the church in her beliefs, what she holds, what she confesses, and he does say that it's going to last until the end of time. So that the specific passage that I'm reading. So let me move to the question of how to interpret it if it's got two different interpretations or three different or four different possible interpretations. Well, I mean, even the passage that was excised has more than one possible interpretation. I mean, we could say that what Agatho meant by never having turned away means that, well, what he means there is in each of the previous 6 councils, or in each of the previous 5 councils, or something like that. You know, you could reduce things. You could reduce things in that excision that would make it compatible with what an Orthodox or Byzantine person is going to say would not contradict conciliar business. So I think that it's not just, well, there's more than one way of interpreting the passage, right? Because there's more than one way to interpret almost everything. I mean, we can get real crazy here, right? Like if I was in court and they asked me, Mr. Ybarra, did you commit this? Did you kill victim so and so? And I say yes. And then someone later on says, well, in his mind at the time, he meant what yes is to us is actually no in his mind, right? That would be an alternative reading, right?
It sounds like my wife.
Well, so I think that.
What do you want for dinner? What you want? No.
So I think that, there's always going to be a few different ways to interpret something, and I know there's other ways where that's not the case. But in Agatho's the second portion where he talks about Rome being preserved from error, that I thought would make it an even stronger claim to Rome's infallibility or indefectibility of some sort, is that the text there, the pronouns are referring back to the Church of Rome, which Agatho says is the foundation of the Orthodox faith. So I don't know if I can do this, Daniel, but maybe for the both of us, if I could share my screen, I could show that passage.
Yeah, go for it. Does it let you?
I think it does. Let me see. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So here in red on the right side, this is the English translation of the Greek. It says, so this is what Agatho is saying. So that the evangelical and apostolic correctness of the Orthodox faith, and then, yes, he has a comma, so he's about to say something about the Orthodox faith, which has its foundation on top of this stable rock of the church of the most blessed chief of the Apostle Peter. Now, just pause right there. Traditionally, when you're using a rock foundation to building relationship, where you're talking about a foundation and then the structure on top of the foundation, what you mean is that what's on top of the foundation is receiving strength and protection, right? And so the rock here is referring to the Roman Church. Now, whether he's right about this, whether he's wrong about this, whether I'm a Catholic or not, it just looks like what's being claimed. And even if we could admit an alternative interpretation, because in my video I did say you could read it another way, but I think it's just hard to read it in another way. But here it's saying the Roman Church is the foundation of the apostolic correctness of the Orthodox faith. And then, after referring to the Roman Church, he says it's the Church of Peter, which by his grace, so it's also saying that I take this to mean another description about what's just being referred to. Is there a strict, inflexible grammatical rule about this? No. But usually when we talk like this, we're expanding upon the immediate antecedent. And because the immediate antecedent is situating the Roman Church as the supporting strength of the Orthodox faith, it would seem to stand to reason that what he says afterwards, which by his grace and assistance, but well, by whose grace? It's Peter, right? It's talking about Peter. It's a very mystical way of understanding things. Even Catholics don't talk like this anymore, which is interesting. But Agatho says, by Peter's grace and assistance is kept immaculate from every error. So what does it mean for Peter to be active in assisting something? Well, in the context here, he assists the Roman Church because that's his church, right? And it's the ministry. Elsewhere in Agatho's letter, he says the ministry that Peter was given is the ministry that his successor has. That ministry was also said to be under the animation of Christ's promise. I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. So that intersects with what this is saying. And then Agatho says, Luke 22 has proven true. How? Is it by various patriarchs upholding the faith? Is it by the general laity and the hierarchy of the whole church upholding? And that's some sort of like a corporate Petrine effusion or diffusion around the whole corporate church? Or he says it's all the apostolic pontiffs, my predecessors, which again directly contradicts the conclusion of the council. I even write that in my book. It contradicts the anathema of Honorius. It does. But it does seem to me that Agatho thinks that what he's saying here, and the best way to read this, is that the divine promise given to Peter, which has its application in all of his successors, is what's meant here. Now, I could be wrong about that, but that's my best, even if I wanted this to be wrong, because I mean, there's been times, even as a Catholic, where I've actually wanted to be dissuaded from my convictions. And even if I wanted this to be wrong, I don't know if I could stand on thick ice trying to interpret this in an alternative way. Is there a second reading? Yes. But like I said, there's a second reading even to the passage that the council supposedly excised. That's the other thing. I don't think that they excised it. Of course, that leaves me without an explanation for why some of the Greek copies don't have it. But then, I brought up afterwards how copies that existed in monasteries in Thessaloniki and Constantinople and other places, they were aware of that passage about the historical inerrancy in Rome. It was cited at Florence, and I'm not aware, of any objection when it was read in Latin and Greek at Florence for both speakers. So yeah, I would say, there is a few different interpretations you can give to this. If you feel real groovy on a certain night, you could probably pull out 10, 15. But I think the best one, the most straightforward one, is that.
Can I ask two questions, Eric, just for clarification?
Yeah.
So the first one, this quote here that is on the screen, this is understood that it is in the context of the particular geographical church of Rome, locally, not.
Yeah.
This is not understood by anybody to be like universal, right?
I don't know of any commentator who would say that what Agatho means by, if you see there in the Greek on the left, the genitive of origin, Petru, ecclesias, when that comes up, I think 3 times in Agatho's letter, And it comes up so many other times in the 6th and 7th and 8th century, always in reference to the historical Roman Church.
Okay. And then the other question is, you mentioned it contradicting Honorius's situation. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so in Agatho's letter, he says that all of his predecessors, which one of them was Honorius, he says all of his predecessors not only did not err or turn aside from the truth, but he said that they were vigilant in upholding and strengthening the brethren. Well, most Catholic theologians admit that Honorius was at least condemned for negligence. They call it negligence. It's one of the worst interpretations of it you could possibly get, in my opinion. But they at least admit that Honorius, he may have been Orthodox in intention, but he was condemned for negligence. Well, Agatho's even saying that Honorius was not negligent. He's not just Orthodox, he was vigilant to protect the faith. Well, that contradicts what the council saw. That contradicts what Pope Leo II, who's the man who came into the papal office right after Agatho. It contradicts what everybody believes today.
Right. So would you say then that's what I would also be kind of an honorific? He's not trying to be. It's like no, all have sinned, all have fallen short, but it doesn't have to be. Literally.
It's possible that he had. It's possible that he had a distinction in mind where he thought, well, what I mean is all my predecessors did this when they were proclaiming universal decrees, but that's just kind of a stretch. I don't think it's an honorific either, though. I don't think it's an empty honorific either. I think what we have here is a bald-faced contradiction. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks for that. Go ahead.
I wouldn't be that mean to Agatho. I mean, vigilance means, you're awake at night protecting the thief from breaking into the house. Doesn't mean the thief can't succeed in any circumstance. So it's I think sometimes we need to not go too many steps with some of these statements. I know from what I heard, it's I think there's some overstating of the evidence based on what is at least presently available. And what I mean by that, for example, is like, this interpretation of Agatho's letter was posed to people during Florence. But again, if we don't have a record of the response saying, yes, it's in our manuscript, that doesn't inveigh against what we have in the manuscripts. I just want people to be aware. What we're talking about the manuscripts is that the most reliable Greek doesn't have it, because the most reliable Greek manuscript is Parasinus Gracchus 1115. And this manuscript originates from Rome. It's believed to originate from the year 774 to 775. So actually predating all the earliest Latin manuscripts. And it was devised in Rome actually as a polemical florilegium, or florilegia, because there's several topics, against Rome's enemies, particularly the Byzantines. Trying to prove the Filioque as patristic, trying to prove the Pope's role in the church. And so this really demands the question, right? If this manuscript originates in the 8th century, and its preserved version today is from the chancery of Beckus of Constantinople, who's a Union, who's on board with the Council of Lyon. They certainly had no intent to remove this passage. This passage is missing despite itself. And that's why it's sort of like in a court of law, we'd call this a hostile witness. So there's a hostile witness, but he concurs with something that's important. This is highly relevant because he has no motive not to. And so hostile witness for the historian when it comes to text is very important. And so it's its absence is something that is important, and not in the sort of unthinking way where this means, well, then it wasn't in the Latin either, as I argue here. That doesn't apply in St. Agatho's letter. But the importance is that it demonstrates intent in the council. And if we have something that's demonstrable, that was excised, it had to have a reason, that at least gives us a basis for interpreting the text the way as I put forward. Erick has his own reading of the passages we saw on the screen. And he says he's not aware of any commentator. Like I said, I already granted, because I oppose appeals to just authority, that grammatically Erick could have his interpretation. But if I could simply make the appeal to authority, is I'm not aware of any translator that interprets that parenthetical statement the way Erick does. There's not a lot of these translations, but of those that exist that are published, I'm not aware of any translator that does. When I read it, it naturally reads to me the way I pose it. And so we both say, well, I'm on thin ice if I go the other way, and I feel I'm on the thin ice the other way. That's where I would go back to again. The excision from the Greek demonstrates intent, that the council was not willing to grant certain a limitless honorific here, right? So it's not that the role of St. Peter wasn't important. It wasn't that the role of Rome wasn't important, but it was not seen in this unmodified sense. And the council makes that clear. While I may infer that from St. Agatho, I think the excision from the Greek from the Conciliar Fathers makes that abundantly clear. And being that that's the case, it kind of loses its force in a polemical context, where if someone's going to say, well, and we won't name names, but we've seen polemical videos that will say, well, look, the Sixth Ecumenical Council accepts this letter. Remember, as we said before, no one's concerned about diotheletism. They're all concerned about the passing papal and Roman and Petrine observations. Well, okay, you could make that argument, but now what do we do when we actually have a documentary reason to say, well, the Conciliar Fathers, because the majority are Greek, did not have this limitless, unqualified sense, because through the excision, it demonstrates qualification, right? I know that's boring. Sorry, audience, boring you, but real history does require these procedural matters to be taken into consideration. As a larger observation, I do think, again, the methodology of how we're approaching this is very different, which is why I think Erick and I come to different conclusions. I'm really not very theologically minded. It'd be great if I was, but I'm not this philosopher. I'm not this holy man. I'm not very theologically minded. I try to be good for a layman, right?
Craig, you'd love St. Ephraim then, because I'm the same way. You'd love St. Ephraim because he gets people like us. Not to feel that's a commercial.
We were to say that from Assyria. So that being said, I'm not this great theological mind, but if I go, well, how do I feel theologically? Which, because I'm not a teacher in the church or anything, it's kind of irrelevant. I believe there's a universal Petrine inheritance, because I think the entire episcopacy originates in St. Peter. We talked about this in your show, by the way, Subdeacon. This is something that's in also Oriental Orthodox in their inheritance, theological inheritance, and in your canons. Now that I've read your canons, so it's in their inheritance as well. So, like when we see a honorific, and as Erick says, the honorific has to have some literal application here, because the grace of St. Peter himself is what's relevant in the passage we're talking about. That it's theologically, for me, it's not troubling to me, because I just look at the universal Petrine inheritance, right? This may be something where, again, the Roman Catholic perspective, they're not going to, there's popes that say that all the bishops have an inheritance from Peter. So they're not going to object to that. The difference would be in what peculiar sense they have a stronger or more solitary claim to it, or a I don't know, majority. I don't know how you'd say it, Eric, but like like we're more Petrine, lack of a better term. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I would even grant that due to relics, but we're getting off topic here. I would even grant that due to relics. But that being said, I do think, me speaking as a historian, is we have to, I don't deal with historical texts and then import my theological opinions. You need a theological background to understand a theological historical text. But the actual procedure of interpreting historical texts is we have to deal with demonstrable historical and textual realities when interpreting these texts. We can't just take our theological opinions from 2,000 years in the future and then presuppose they exist 2,000 years past. It must be demonstrated in the documentary text that it did for us then to start doing that. If it's demonstrated from the text, then that's legitimate, which is why I said, well, with the honorifics, I'm approaching the honorific as I would approach the extant honorifics I have, right? So that's a historical judgment call for that reason. That's the basis for it. But that's why I think ultimately, like, I'm not sure if Erick's going to respond or if we want to jump into Pope Adrian. This actually gets into how Pope Adrian's letter is interpreted, because the Petrine and Pauline inheritance is something that's highly relevant and applied to the whole church by that council. And so we could see why, like, the grace of St. Peter and what he does to preserve the church would not be offensive. To the Conciliar Fathers, and sadly has only become offensive in recent years due to the polemical environment within Orthodoxy in the modern era. It's not something you see historically. Mm-hmm. So that'd be my comments.
Yeah, thank you. So a few things. I totally understand, as a historian, you're looking at documents. If you situate a certain family of transmission as most reliable, and then you have to make an explanation for why certain things are not showing up that show up in another family, and you've got to come up with an explanation. We can speculate, right? But one of the things that I keep in mind here is that, yes, I could see why a historian is going to do that, and I might even do that too. Like, I might say, well, it's, look at this discrepancy. Maybe there was an excision at some point. There obviously was an excision at some point. Whether that's in whether it was a couple centuries down the line somehow, or, we don't really know. But I tend to want to go with what the council itself says about Agatho's letter, and over and over again, they make claims that Agatho's letter was received without alteration. So
sorry, I'm laughing because that's always the code for the opposite.
Right.
These
right. So, but my first desire would be to say they actually mean that they accepted the letter without alteration, right? In other words, I'm not coming at this thinking that, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just saying this for rhetorical style here. I'm not coming to the letters of the popes and the emperors and the bishops at the council the same way I would go into reading the letter exchanges between the mafia, families in the mafia, where it's like, okay, obviously, Mr. Corleone said this, but you know how things go here, and this was going to be interpreted here because we know how business rolls. Because I don't want to approach it that way. However, being realistic, there is that bit in Byzantine history. But when we add some of the other dominoes, like, okay, they all said that they accepted Agatho's letter without alteration. I mean, Emperor Constantine IV explicitly said that. So that's one thing. He may have meant it, he may not have meant it, but he said that. All right. So that whether that's 2 points versus 20 points versus 1 point, it doesn't really matter. We take note of it. That's what they said. Number 2, and this is going to be something that's on my side of the table, that is, I interpret another passage in the same letter, not to mention a third one, which is more debatable, but I interpret the other passage that I was showing on the screen as an even more clear, more powerful claim to the fact that Rome is being protected from error, all error, and the present active tense, diamene. I would think that if the council was going to sort of cleanse out things that didn't fit with the Honorian anathema, that would have been another passage to exclude, to avoid complications with conciliar business. But it wasn't. It was left in there, So I've got the statements of the bishops and the emperor. We have an internal portion of the letter that has an even more aggressive claim than the one that was excised at some point from the Greek, some Greek family that was transmitted into the the manuscript family. And then we have the fact that staunch opponents like Barlaam the Calabrian, who eventually became a Catholic, but he was an opponent of Catholicism, and he refuted these claims about Agatho and Hadrian, and Nilus drew from Barlaam. And when Nilus did his research into Agatho, he came up with the objections that they would be giving from the council of the Sixth Council, and he would basically cite in the Greek the same version as the Greek version. And so how did these manuscripts without the excision end up in the hands of star apologists in the East, like Nilus, Simeon the Thessaloniki, Mark of Ephesus? Because when Mark of Ephesus went to the Council of Florence, he brought two documents with him. He brought Nilus's book against the Roman primacy and another document with all of his notes from Nilus. So, and then when we say at the Council of Florence that they, Julian of Caesarini, John Montanaro cite the aggressive claim of Agatho, and nobody objects, of course, that cannot be like 1,000-pound proof that's dropped onto the table. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is we're just letting the woodpecker add all these things in a cumulative way. And it just doesn't seem like it would be reasonable to me to say, yeah, the Greeks had intended to remove that passage in order to make a harmony with the Honorian anathema. It just doesn't seem to make sense to me, but that's my reading. And I think it was a great discussion topic. That's why I made a video on it.
Yeah, it's I think we're at loggerheads ultimately at that issue, that final point of analysis. Because as your video points out, the former passage with the disputed excision is about the past tense, and the, as you say, stronger passage, though I don't see that really as stronger in any polemical sense of where we disagree, has the present tense. But like I said, that would make sense as with the conciliar business, where the authority of Agatho and the Roman synod was necessary for the reception of the council, but also it was necessary ultimately for conciliar business was anathematizing Honorius. So it does make sense to excise the former passage and the latter passage, even for grammatical reasons. I just don't see any basis for excision. In fact, read as is, it seems to me to actually be quite inconvenient for the Roman Catholic polemical view, because it kind of contextualizes the assertions of inerrancy to be about the faith ultimately, as opposed to any specific church. Like I said, it's not only a legitimate translation, I believe to be the most compelling translation of that passage. And so even if we argue over what's the most compelling or not of the translation, the fact that let's just make it a coin flip, it makes it then now it's a non-issue. You don't need to excise anything when you could easily take it in the sense that you wanted to. Now, when it comes to like later texts like Barlaam and whatnot, I'm not aware of the demonstration where they're particularly quoting the excised passage, which would then demonstrate that the excised passage itself textually existed in the Greek that writer was using. I could be wrong, but I didn't see that in your video. It just seemed like they're talking about ideas consistent with overall ideas. And we have to take into consideration, Parasinus Gracchus 1115 is from the 13th century, the time of the Council of Lyon. Barlaam is writing almost 100 years later, at that which point the Turin Codex, which includes that disputed passage in the Greek, exists. And it would make sense that Barlaam is dealing with polemics in Italy. And if I remember right, I think he was sent to a delegation from southern Italy all the way up into France itself, that he would have came across these altered Greek manuscripts. And this is that gets to the conspiracy theories that Barlaam was a fifth columnist that, really didn't have Orthodox convictions and may have intentionally been bringing back to himself. I'm not even going to get into conspiracy theories like that. I'm just going to get to the basic. It makes sense that he would have, if he even quoted it, which I haven't seen demonstrated, that he would be quoting a codex that's from Italy, because that's where he was from. And so that wouldn't be very surprising. It would not really be that another little hole pecked from the woodpecker.
Yeah, and let me be fair to Craig here. I should have said this before. I'm actually not aware of a specific quotation from Barlaam. I'm taking this from a summary of where Nilus got his arguments against the papacy. So this was relayed to me. I'll have to find the author. I could put it into the comments below, and I'll try to find the paragraph that I got it from. So I was just trying to color in where Nilus might have gotten his, because he did throw Agatho into his, 70-page book, a few times. So I figured, speculating he may have gotten it from Barlaam. So yeah.
And I would agree with you that the whole reason even Parasinus Gracchus 115 has these passages from Agatho is precisely for the same intention that Barlaam and others would have it on the Roman Catholic side, right? And which actually, I argue, shows the reliability of the rendering, because their intent is to show, look at all these great things about the Pope by St. Agatho, right? So I like I said, there's a very fine detail here, and I would just quibble. We would need a demonstration textually of that passage, because otherwise we'd have to go with what most reliably is the earliest rendering.
Yeah, completely fair.
But if you're ready, you're saying Pope Adrian, we could jump into that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just for clarification for the audience, because there's a lot of OOs watching, Agatho is canonized by
those poor guys.
Agatho is canonized by both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. Yeah.
Yes.
And Hadrian is not.
No, he, as far as I know, he's not a saint in Catholicism. I mean, you've got people saying of pious memory, within a few years after his death, but he's not a canonized saint in our community.
Got it.
It's interesting because actually Pope Adrian was a very long-lived pope, which usually that helps one's memory. And he was a very strong pope. It was a stable time for the papacy, so it's kind of surprising from my perspective if that's the case. I mean, I don't know. I don't know the hagiographies for the Roman Catholic side, but it's because he was a long-lasting pope. So anyway, I mean, if we want to jump into it, with Pope Adrian, as we were talking about before, his letter, there's letters, ultimately. The first letter is the conciliar decree of Rome 785. And that's where most of the debate will be. But with this debate, we have to have recourse to the other letter, which is, it would have been written synodically, but it's not a decree. It's a letter to St. Tarasius of Constantinople. And so one is called Letter of the Emperors, sometimes called in jargon JE 2448. I prefer calling that because that's shorter. And the letter to Tarasius is JE 2449. And so as a review of this, the Greek lacks a lot of papal stuff in JE 2448. And the Latin does not lack these things. And the differences between JE 2449 between Greek and Latin are more about jurisdiction and the actual ordination of Tarasius, and not really anything about the papacy, which could or may not be relevant, and maybe we'll unpack some of that. And so with the first letter to the emperors, 2448, scholars have generally just taken the sort of, whether it's unthinking or it's well-informed, I'll let the audience decide, just said, okay, Greek is what the Greeks thought, Latin's what the Latins thought. Right? You know, kind of basic, right? This thesis, though repeated into recent years, Dvornik, Luth, Szyszewski. So it's not like this is from the ancient past that, you know, from the 1800s or people had this idea. It's been recently published by some very big names. But other big names and important people, I'd say less so Wallach, but I mean, Lambers and Richard Price, right? Lambers and Price are, Lambers is the living authority on Nicaea II. So that's important, right? You are the living guy who is the utmost expert on the topic. And obviously, Father Richard Price is the living authority on all the ecumenical councils, the pre-schism church, right? So you have two of the living authorities now with a different thesis, right? Doesn't mean there's no living authority. Luth and Szyszewski are still alive, but we're not going to put them at the, they're not the New York Yankees of ecumenical councils. All right. So I think it's fair to say the New York Yankees of the ecumenical councils have a different thesis, which maybe to really distill what it is that the Latin renderings of Nicaea II, and the differences are all papal, by the way. They're all papal and jurisdictional. So it's like, unlike the other letter, this is pretty much all we care about because that's where the differences are. If you really want to get into the weeds, Anastasius Librarian does correct some of the iconophile philologia rather, but that's not relevant for our conversation. So that being said, when you have living authority saying the Latin is what's reliable and original to the Greek, and the Greek was altered by Photius for political reasons, you got to pay attention. Because it's not like this is just some random guy saying this. These are like, if you're going to talk to anyone on earth that gets started on this topic, you have to talk to them. If you're going to read anything, you have to read what they wrote, because these are the living authorities. And so it's with, with a lot of careful thought that I've recently published against this. And God willing, very soon, there'll be also a peer-reviewed article against their thesis. And so this will be an ongoing discussion and scholarship on this topic. And so this is where really we could go into three different directions. And I think for any of these directions, it would require demonstration that that direction is a right path to go down. If the Latin's authentic, and I'll let Erick defend that, but if you want some help, I know their arguments very well. Then what we do have would be statements that could be interpreted, if we're not going to take them as just blanket honorifics, statements that are consistent with aspects of Vatican I, sorry. Direct jurisdiction could be inferred in the longer ending of the letter to the emperors, 2448. The idea that the Petrine of Herodance is solely Rome's is in the first Petrine passage in that same letter in 2448. So it's we actually start getting things where, like, yes, if you really want to, you can interpret, like Erick said, you get a 15 interpretations on a gnarly evening, if you want to, of anything, right? But then you start getting to, all right, well, this does really sound like what it's trying to say, here in the Latin. And so this makes the absence in the Greek curious. And this is where we get to other directions. The majority scholarly opinion has been, which I don't agree with, by the way, but this is the majority opinion, is that, again, the Greek and Latin show what was accepted in the council, what wasn't. And this actually was what was the official written opinion of Anastasius the Librarian, who's our sole source for the entire Latin letters on this topic. And so this is an old interpretation and a consistent one. Now, the argument I make, and people make fun of it, but it's going to be published. It's already published largely in my book, and it's going to be further published, is that these are actually interpolations by Anastasius the Librarian, which now opens up a very interesting avenue of the context being in the Photian schism, as they say, in the 9th century. The context surrounding the deposition of Pope Nicholas. Instead of, let's say, the papal doctrines coming out of the Vatican States after the collapse of the Byzantine papacy and the Byzantine Empire in Italy, what we have is something 100 years later, and it's not directly connected to an ecumenical council where both sides received, which then ties into what Erick and I were talking about in the beginning, that conciliar contextualist mindset, where we can't just disregard what's accepted in a council, even if it's in passing, because it's consistent with the minds of the fathers there that are weighing in on the primary topic at issue in Nicaea 2 would be icons. And so, as I would say, for any of these paths for us to go down to, it would require demonstration. And I don't know if you want to make the case for Latin, or I'll just very briefly say why Lambertus and Price are wrong. And maybe I'll just say this because I can actually sum it up in very few words. I can't give you moral certainty that the majority scholarly opinion is wrong, even though I disagree with it. But I could give absolute evidence that Lambertus and Price thesis is wrong. And here's where it is. It's in the Collectio Britannica. We have independently preserved in the Collectio Britannica largely all the passages that are in Anastasius translation Latin and missing in the Greek minutes of Nicaea 2. So we have an independent authority that shows us, okay, so other than what Anastasius himself wrote, perhaps, we have at least something else in the Latin that matches it. And so we could see that's at least consistent with the majority opinion. The Latin always had it, the Greek didn't. But I'm going to argue this actually renders impossible, actually impossible. I mean, maybe one out of like a quadrillion, it's not like going to oppose the laws of thermodynamics, but probability-wise renders almost impossible Price and Lambert's thesis. Here's why. Because in the passages we have in the Collectio Britannica, we know they're an earlier Latin, because the Latin preserved by them also includes some of the Florilegia, of the iconophile Florilegia that's in that letter. The Latin is very different. It doesn't say anything different conceptually, because Anastasius made a retroversion from the Greek. This is censure to the thesis of Lambertus and Price, is that when Anastasius made a faithful, supposedly, retroversion from the Greek had all those papal passages, because how else did they find themselves in Anastasius' translation of the Greek and back into Latin? Here's why that's impossible. Because the Collectio Britannica in the iconophile passages says all the same stuff, because, right, Anastasius would have no reason to retrovert the Greek into Latin and alter the pro-icon stuff. He wasn't against that, right? But it makes sense, because whenever you translate something from one language back into your own language, words are going to change, even if the meanings are the same. So this is very common if you speak to anyone that knows more than one language and they're translating between friends. You say something in English, and then they say it's a Greek to that person speaks Greek back to them, and they say it back to you. It'll be same stuff, even if they're quoting you, but it'll be slightly different words. It's like a rule for retroversion. I don't know how simpler to make this. And that's why it's impossible to have word for word concurrences in a retroversion, right? And not have it once, but to have it over sentences and sentences and paragraphs is literally impossible. It's actually such a glaring problem in what's really rightfully Lambert's thesis, because Father Richard Price just faithfully repeats it, that it's actually surprising that he doesn't appreciate this. And hopefully maybe he will after my published work is out on this, because I demonstrate this line from the Collectio Britannica. And the Collectio Britannica's, the photocopies of the manuscripts, like, it's actual manuscript, is online. Though last I heard it was that the British Museum the website was down, but it's probably, I guess, back up today. Anyone could follow this. It's not like this is esoteric stuff. You have to go to Great Britain and actually open up the book. They photocopy the whole book. It's not copy and paste, but you could look at the Latin and compare it to Lambert's critical edition and whatever you have to do. And so I would concede that the ending of the letter to the emperors, which contains certain papal stuff in it, which Erick and I disagree about, the ending of that letter, according to Anastasius, when he's translated, says wasn't in the Greek in his day. So if it matches word for word the Collectio Britannica, well, that could work, because why wouldn't Anastasius just copy word for word what he had from the Latin from something that's supposedly moved from the Greek? So that's not so persuasive. If I were to argue, well, that shows no retroversion. That would be expected if we trust Anastasius on that point. However, the earlier passage, which gets quoted more, about the singular Petrian inheritance, the earlier passage is word for word, other than literally one or two words which have the same meaning, because back then people would make manuscripts by hearing someone read it, right? So that happens with manuscripts, but almost word for word identical over lines and lines and lines. Same with Anastasius. This means it was impossible that earlier passage was retroverted from the Greek. And there collapses the whole thesis of Lambert's and Wallach, by the way, on that particular point. It's literally impossible. And so they will have recourse to respond to my evidence, which I pose in my article and in my book. And people could look it up themselves, because it's, at least the Collectio Britannica, getting hands on Lambert's stuff may be more difficult. But that being said, they have recourse to these sources to check these theses. I will say one other little quibble, which I'm very disappointed about by both Father Richard Price and Dr. Erick Lambert, which is this. I found out after I did all my research, did all this hard work, I was posed an article by John Calarafi from a French journal by a scholar named El Seurat from 100 years ago. So I read it, but before I asked John, I'm like, so what's he exact saying? And John's like, it sounds like he's saying both my side and your side. It's confusing me. So I read the article, and to make a long story short, to my utter surprise, Seurat completely anticipates, because it doesn't prove out, he says his suspicions. He anticipates the conclusions I have. Why is this relevant? Well, one, it shows I'm not a nut. It shows that someone else looking at this was saying there's something more here. Like, one of the points he makes is it doesn't make sense that the Greek would have been edited for the reasons, let's say, Lambert's later gives, because of some offense taken at the papacy, because then they would have edited the letter to Tarasius, which has stuff about the papacy. Says that doesn't make sense. He also mentions, which I agree, that the internal consistency of the Greek rendering makes a lot more sense. And we could get into that if Erick wants, but there's much more internal consistency of the Greek, where I would say the Latin originally read as the Greek, which is why I favor the interpolation thesis. But what is really disappointing is that Seurat is neither cited, even though they cite other old writers, by Price or Lambert's. He's completely absent, almost as if what he was perceiving to be the case was inconsistent and inconvenient for their point. And that's very disappointing, because now what my scholarship puts forward is demonstrations of some of Serraz's speculations being proved out from the sources. Serraz didn't have Collectio Britannica, for example. He didn't have a critical edition of Nicaea II because Lamber's made it years after his death, right? Based on standing the shoulders of these giants, because I'm a nobody, we're able now to solve this question. But I was not the first one to perceive the direction this was going to. This is something Serraz perceived 100 years ago. And so I know this is highly technical, so I'll just summarize very basically. It's that the best evidence is that Anastasius added papal interpolations to deal with a polemical situation in the 860s, ultimately the deposition of Pope Nicholas. And we could get into the weeds, and the more we get into the weeds, the stronger and more demonstrations we have of that. But that would be the distillation. Otherwise, a secondary possibility is, yes, the Latin said what the Latin said, and the Greek said what the Greek said, and obviously the Greek is what was accepted by the council. But what is not possible is the double Photian forgery thesis of Lamber's and Price. It's literally impossible. It's disappointing. That's the most recent thesis given in the English language that people have mass exposure to in the minutes of Price. What I offer here and in my published research is a corrective to that. So that'd be my comments.
Daniel, you have anything to say in between?
Nothing. What? So, Craig saying the disappointing thing. I'm really excited to see what you have to say about that. I know that you have strong opinions from before. When me having dialogue with you, Eric, you have strong opinions about Nicaea II in general. I would say, when I say strong, I mean it's not like the mainstream opinion. I think you have very unique views.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
perhaps. I mean, I haven't found anybody who says exactly what I'm saying.
yeah, I haven't either, and you've been saying it for years. So yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to this.
Okay. So let me first say that the research that I found from Richard Price, Eric Lambers, who I was actually able to develop some correspondence with him, and he sent me some material that I just did my best at trying to read. But I got what he was trying to say. I got what he was trying to say. I got that Price was trying to basically just carry over the findings of Lambert's. I found some other scholars for this period. I think the names are Leslie Baker and John Halden, and some others. And they kept referring to Lambert's and Price. Now, for me, I found the claim that the text manipulation was done under Photius to be kind of a stretch. I did. So I do cite Price, Lambers, and some others for their commentary on how unlikely it is that Hadrian's Latin was interpolated later by Anastasius, or that it was somehow omitted from the council in some way. I think that they're right about that. But I don't think that the explanation that they have to explain the discrepancy between the Greek and the Latin is very persuasive. So I actually agree with Craig on that. And what else should I say? Okay. So my primary response to this would not be to try and insist on the Latin being the original that the council accepted. I would probably argue for that. It's been a long time, to be honest with you, since I've really looked at this. If I haven't read Craig's book yet, although with as many people that are talking about it, I'm definitely going to get it eventually. But anybody who reads my book on this section, it's not. I think in the footnotes I make it clear I'm not buying everything that Price and Lambers are saying. So to make our time the most worthwhile, what I would say is that the Greek version of what's recorded in the Acts, let's just go with what, in other words, we could save a lot of time here. Let's just say that it is correct that the Greek version is the original authentic acceptation of the council. Let's just go with that, right? And let's just say perhaps Anastasius interpolated the other Latin, additions later for whatever motive, right? So I would say that the Greek is actually more in support of the papacy than the Latin version. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and like, what is it about the Greek that you would say hit?
Yeah,
Like, yeah,
you're right. So let me say this. I don't think Hadrian's letter again says anything like it doesn't detail anything about like what Vatican I says about when the Pope speaks without error. Nothing like that. I think what both the Latin version and the Greek version say are that, again, Christ did something with Peter or Peter and Paul, okay, that has real, everlasting, and perpetual implications for the historic Roman Church until the end of time. So that might get you 10 yards away from Vatican I. It may not be Vatican I. It may be very different than Vatican I, but whatever it's saying, if it's real and not an empty honorific, if it's real, I still think that the needle is pointing more in the direction of the papal claims than it is in some other direction, some other direction. Okay. So let me show what I mean. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to share what the Greek says from Hadrian and show why I think that. Let's just go with the Greek. And I think the Greek will support my perspective. And we'll see. Maybe it doesn't. But here, I'll share my screen. Tell me if you guys see it. Do you see it?
yeah, we're good. If you could just put it through the slideshow so that they could
Yeah,
come.
let me try to do that.
Yeah.
There we go. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not going to read all this. This is just some things I jotted down before we did our stream. The first point I wanted to make was that when they read the letter at Nicaea, they all said that they accepted Hadrian's letter. And so I think that militates against the idea that the letter was changed at the council, which I think Craig agrees with. So it's really not it's not too pertinent to our conversation. So there you go.
So you're saying it proves it was changed or wasn't changed?
Wasn't changed.
I don't think it proves that it wasn't changed, but I think it's worth noting that when they read the Latin and the Greek of Hadrian's letter at the council, afterwards they said, "Hey, everybody, what do you think?" And nobody said, "Well, adjustments need to be made," or anything like that. They just say, "We accept it." Now, that doesn't prove they didn't make any adjustments, but I thought that you don't. It was my understanding that you don't even believe they made changes at the council because
they did actually. They removed insults to the
Oh,
consecration of Tarasius to the
Tarasius
patriarch,
is right, but not the papal.
and jurisdictional
papal.
claims.
Okay, so you did. Okay, so you do believe they took out jurisdictional claims.
Yeah, and that actually explains why they go back and forth saying, "Yeah, we didn't make any changes," right? Because they did.
No.
And that's why Anastasius and we have a a papal document in the 10th century, they repeat the same thing. So it's not like I'm just pulling this out of my hat.
Yeah.
Okay.
That there were
changes. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. So from my perspective, what I'm going to put down, the first domino that I'm putting down on the table is that I notice that when they read Hadrian's letter in the second session, afterwards they ask the bishops, "What do you guys think?" And Tarasius says, "I accept it." He refers to, Paul's quote to Romans chapter 1, verse 5, "Your faith is proclaimed throughout the whole world." I think it was like 266 bishops and 12 monks. Yeah, 260 bishops and 10 monks, including Saint Sabas from Studios Monastery, which it's a side point, but the council says they accepted it, right? Now, that's just a domino on the table. That doesn't mean, Erick's saying that this is proof that there were no changes. It's just a notation that they said they accepted it. That's it.
Is there any particular, as a follow-up from a question from earlier, but since we're going over this, I think it's important to ask, for Hadrian to not be canonized, was there a particular reason? Is there something questionable?
I haven't the slightest clue. In my studies, I've never come across anything that would militate against it, other than perhaps an overly compromised toleration of the Frankish resistance to Nicaea.
So the imperial.
But even then, popes in the near future are still referring back to Hadrianus of holy or pious memory. So, if somebody knows more than me, please, let me know. But at this point, I just want to say that the council says, like the bishops, Tarasius, they all say that they accept it, right?
Okay.
Now, they're primarily thinking about the veneration of images. Let's not kid ourselves here. They're not all saying, yes, we accept the papal claims. That I don't even know if that's really what they were thinking about, to be honest with you. I think they were thinking about what he said about the veneration of images.
Sure.
Right? To be fair. All right. So, all right. So here's the Greek version of Hadrian's letter. It's basically what you're going to get in Henry Percival, his translation. But I have a different translation at the end, which comes from, this is another team effort from Greek speakers, Orthodox Catholic people that I've consulted, who are Greek speakers, to help me in this classical translation. But this is what the Greek says. Can you see it? Can you guys see it? Or should I try to make it bigger?
I can't see the bottom sentence.
Oh, you can't see the bottom. Can you see the bottom, Daniel, or no?
Well, it's just,
I can see that the end of the paragraph, but if you could,
all right, I can see it now. If I do this, I don't know if that looks good.
If there's a way to zoom, I don't know if there is.
Or the holy and chief apostles,
I can see it. It's
themselves to set up the Catholic and Orthodox faith and laid it down.
You know what? Let me do something here. Hold on. Let me go here and then see if I can copy this. Okay, copy it. And then, let's see.
Subdeacon, you got any jokes you could tell while we're waiting for that to be fixed?
It's funny you mentioned that, Craig. There's a saint in the Syriac Orthodox Church, Bar Hebraeus. He actually wrote a joke book. It might be, I don't know the history of joke books, but it might be one of the earliest joke books in history. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if that's a defeater or a winner for you guys.
I mean, I'm happy about it. I think it's pretty cool.
Okay, let's try this one more time. Let me see if this is going to work. Let's see.
There you go. Yeah.
Let me zoom in again real quick. Hold on. I'm still getting used to this new laptop here. Okay, here we go. Zoom.
All right, I could read that.
All right, so we'll start here. It'll scroll down. Okay. But can you see that so far? If the ancient Orthodox?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the portion from Hadrian's letter, an English translation of the Greek, which, again, for the listeners and for Craig and Daniel, I think that this version still in the direction of support to something like a Catholic would say is a defense for the papacy. Does it come full circle to exactly an explicit claim about ex cathedra infallibility, where outside conditions there's a possibility of error and that it's this and that? No. But what it does is it's a rock's throw. It's a far rock's throw in the direction of what Vatican I is saying. All right, so Hadrian says, if the ancient orthodoxy be perfected and restored by your means, and what he means here is Irene and her son, Constantine the Sixth. So if the ancient orthodoxy be perfected and restored by your means in those regions in the East, and the venerable icons be placed in their original state, you will then be partakers with the Lord Constantine, emperor of old, now in the divine keeping, and the Empress Helena, who made conspicuous and confirmed the Orthodox faith, and exalted still more your holy mother, the Catholic and Roman and spiritual church. And with the Orthodox emperors who ruled after them. And so your most pious and heaven-protected name, speaking of honorifics, likewise will be set forth as that of another Constantine and another Helena, being renowned and praised through the whole world, by whom the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church is restored. And especially if you follow the tradition of the Orthodox faith of the Church of the Holy Peter and Paul, so the faith of the Holy Church of Peter and Paul, the chief apostles, Koryphaion apostolon, this is plural for heads, or the head of the apostles, and embrace their singular vicar, auton bikaron, as opposed to bikaria. So their vicar, singular, as the emperors who reigned before you of old both honored their vicar, again, singular, and loved him, singular, with all their heart. And if your sacred majesty honors the most holy Roman Church of the chief apostles, again, plural, referring to the Peter and Paul, to whom was given power, exousia, or potestas in the Latin, to whom was given power by God the Word. That's referring to Jesus Christ, to loose and to bind sins in heaven and earth. For they, it's important to understand, they here is still referring to the singular, it's referring to the chief of the apostles, Peter and Paul. For they will extend their shield over your power, and all barbarous nations shall be put under your feet, and wherever you go, they will make you conquerors. And here's really where you got to kind of like pay attention. So there's a reason why that they will extend their shield, okay, over, and why the empire would benefit. Because the holy and chief apostles, again, Peter and Paul themselves, who set up the Catholic and Orthodox faith, have laid it down as a written decree that all successors who occupy their thrones will hold their faith and remain in it all the way to the end. Okay? So, what I take from this passage is Hadrian is claiming, let's just say Hadrian wrote this, right? Hadrian is claiming that the Church of Rome is a recipient of some special power. What's the origin of that power? It's the apostles Peter and Paul, who themselves received exousia, power, from Jesus Christ, and it's a reference to Matthew 16, the power of the keys, right? And what Hadrian is saying is, if the emperors, Empress Irene and Constantine VI, if they follow the Roman Church, they then will have released upon them all these benefits from Peter and Paul through the singular vicar. Remember, I said that. Bikaran is the singular vicar of Peter and Paul. So this is talking about the Roman bishop as the vicar of Peter and Paul. And then it says that the empire will have all this benefit, barbarian nations will be dispersed, because the protecting shield of Peter and Paul will apply. And then it says, well, that's important to know because Peter and Paul, who set up the Catholic religion, they laid it down as a written decree. And the Greek word here for the written decree, some translations have law, as if like a command, like, hey, you should really keep the faith. That's not what the Greek word means. If you do a study on what this Greek word means, it means a constitutional decree, like laying down a constitutional governing rule. They laid it down that all their successors, okay, and this is still referring to the singular vicar. This is not a reference. I don't interpret this as a reference to the episcopate at large. I refer to this as the vicars of Peter and Paul in the Roman Church, because that's what's being said, right? Hadrian is talking about the Holy Roman Church. So he's basically saying the Roman pontiffs will keep the faith of Paul and Peter, and some English translations say that they should keep it, but there's no indication in the Greek that the word should is there. It's that they will hold their faith and remained in it. There's the same Greek word for when Agatho said that Peter, by his grace, diamene, keeps the Roman church free from error. This is that they will hold their faith and diamene all the way to the end. And the Greek word for the end there, I don't have it in front of me, but I can get you the word, and the definition. It doesn't just mean like to the end of their lives. It's talking about to the end of time. The consummation is what the term means. And so it's still talking about something that pertains to the Roman Church that will benefit the empire on the basis of a power and a promise given to Peter and Paul that descends to the Roman pontiff and will be reliable all the way to the end of time. Okay. Now, let me just give a couple of reasons why I think that translate that this is the way to take it. Because afterwards, let's see here. I don't know if I'm sharing my screen. Present Agatho. You might have to pull it in. Yeah, there we go. From the current slide. Here we go. Sorry, I didn't have them in front of me, the Greek word, because I had to put it in Microsoft Word for you guys to be able to see it. But that last portion, I translated like this. For the holy and chief apostles, Peter and Paul themselves, who set up the Catholic and Orthodox faith, have laid it down as a written constitution that all their successors who occupy their thrones will hold their faith and remain in it to the end. This is suntelais, referring to the consummation of all things. So this kind of language is referring to something that's divine. You don't say this about something that you think is potentially going to fail in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, and then go dormant, for however else long. And what else? Okay, yeah, so that we have that. Then Hadrian goes on to quote from the story of Sylvester. I'm not sure how familiar the readers are with some of these apocryphal stories and legends that originated in the 5th century. Some people do not take them as legends anymore. It was not taken as fake in the first millennium, at least by the majority. But almost everybody believed that Constantine gave Pope Sylvester a certain gift of authority as a result of being baptized by him, healing him of his leprosy. I can't really go into the backstory of all this, but there is a collection of legends called the Actus Sylvestri, or the Acts of Sylvester, Pope Sylvester. And Pope Hadrian immediately starts to quote from the Actus Sylvestri right after he says what I told you just now before about how the vicar of Peter and Paul, the Roman pontiff, will remain in the truth until the end of time. He immediately goes into this Actus Sylvestri, and that document itself is recognized by the council, right? Well, that document, this portion is not cited, but in that document, in the second book of this Actus Sylvestri, there's a period of 7 days where Constantine gives authority to Pope Sylvester. And the fourth day gift, it goes like this. And this is in the Greek and the English. This is how it was understood by everybody who accepted the authenticity of Actus Sylvestri, which means Photius of Constantinople, who in his Nomocanon refers to the Actus Sylvestri. It's very likely that many in the Byzantine liturgical tradition drew from this. So this is not talking about a Western thing only. This is also absorbed into Byzantine thought. And it says this: on the fourth day, the privilege was conferred upon the Roman Church and its pontiff that in the entire Roman world, priests might treat him as their head, caput, just as all judges of the Roman world hold the king, emperor. So in other words, Hadrian immediately goes into talking about this story with Constantine and Pope Sylvester. And that document gives this privilege to the Roman Church. It doesn't matter if it's Paul, Peter, Andrew, James, whoever you want to throw in there. It gives this authority to the Roman Church and its pontiff. And this Actus Sylvestri was accepted even by Mark of Ephesus. In fact, it ended up being basically the premature version of what became the Donation of Constantine, which was accepted by Theodore Balsamon, an Eastern Orthodox canonist, Mark of Ephesus. You hear about the Donation of Constantine. Some of the listeners here might not know this, but Byzantine canonists such as Matthias Blasteres accepted the act the Actus of Silvestri and the donation. These were taken by, and some scholars say it was basically unanimously received in Byzantium, all the way up until a certain point where it started to be questioned. But it was used for various reasons. But in any case, what Hadrian said in his Latin letter that we say was, where it was the head of the church and all that, I think the Greek says the same thing. It even gives that perpetuity part where, the Latin part is like, well, what's the Latin saying that the Greek doesn't? Well, the Latin gives more weight to this idea of Petrine exclusivity, and it gives weight to perpetuity, like to the end of time, right? Well, I think that's in the Greek version. You just add Paul there. I don't see why that's a problem. I mean, even Anastasius adds Paul to the preeminence of the Roman Church in some of his documents. And then the last thing I want to say here, and I'm not going to read this out loud. The listeners can just hit pause and read it for themselves. This is what shows up in the letter to Tarasius, and this is something that Craig did talk about, where in this passage, I see the same claims that are made in the Latin version that Craig says was interpolated by Anastasius later in dealing with Ignatius and Photius. So this would be something that was read out loud at Nicaea 787, and it's got the same claims. In my understanding, to make this very simple for the listeners, it's got the same exact substance as what is purported to have been, not said from the Latin interpolated version later. So I hope that makes sense, Daniel. I have some scholars here who agree with me. I'm not going to go through everything here, but this is another thing you can hit pause at. This is the Greek version of Hadrian's epistle to Tarasius with that specific passage in bold and underline. And this is where I do agree with Price. He says, it is to be noted that the Greek text of this letter does not water down. This is talking about the Greek text of the letter to Tarasius. It is to be noted that the Greek text of this letter does not water down Hadrian's claim to supreme authority as the successor of St. Peter in the way that the Greek version of the letter to the emperor does. And then he gives us, he refers to Lambers here. And I know Craig did mention this, and he gave his reasons why he doesn't believe it. But my statement would just mean, hey, if you give me Anastasius's interpolated version and I digest it, I get the same exact digestion from reading the Greek version of the letter to Tarasius. And so that's really what I want to capitalize on.
Thanks, Eric. Right. Appreciate you, man. Craig, you got a response to that?
Let's go, guys. I'll just start with saying that Price is incorrect. Between that, there's papal supremacy, and we now have to define terms. Direct jurisdiction. If we're going to speak of the Pope being the universal bishop, these are things that are lacking from JE 2449. We, as a scholar, that's a certain, I would say, only when you're superstar scholars, they could get away with not being precise. Little guys like me can't be. Publishing on this issue, I was parsing primacy and supremacy. And most academics aren't even comfortable with the word supremacy because it sounds so loaded, like anti-Roman, right? And so my point in saying this is supremacy is a very specific meaning. And you could click pause to what Eric had on screen at pages 171, 172 of Price's translation, and you don't see supremacy. So you could see his observation, but it's not borne out in the source. His observation is incorrect. Supremacy, it could be rightly inferred textually from the first letter. And the reason why that is the case is because in the first letter, it does talk about the Petrine inheritance being something solely in Rome. The relevance of this I'll discuss in a second. But it's we have one of the necessary elements of papal supremacy explicit in the first letter. It's absent in the second letter. Also, in the first letter, we, in the longer ending of that letter, and I argue in my my research is this section is interpolated, and I'll get into the reasons why. In the longer ending of that letter, which is lacking in both what Erick read in the first letter at the ending there, and in the second letter, which we pause on screen, is that the jurisdiction of the Balkans rightfully belongs to the Pope, essentially because he has direct jurisdiction. I could quote if people want it, but that's essentially the reason Anastasius gives. That's papal supremacy. It's not in the second letter. So again, it's factually, I would say, Father Richard Price is wrong in his analysis. We also see the idea, the whole issue of the ecumenical patriarch title is taken issue with in the longer ending. It's an interpolation, by the way, but it's taken issue in the longer ending of the first letter, right? And it calls the Pope the universal Pope, and that's why it takes issue, because Pope and patriarch just mean father, right? So the issue is, no, this title rightly belongs to the Pope. That's papal supremacy. That's in the interpolations in the first letter. It's not in the second letter. And so we have to be very careful, especially now we're going to get into it, the textual evidence interpolations as to the qualitative difference between the first and second letters. Erick says that the same claims or same substance, they are manifestly not. And when we conflate these things like, well, they're similar enough, then I believe we start creating errors in our historical analysis. And so I think it's worth pointing out when it comes to the interpolations is that in the, as we already discussed, the part where it talks about the Pope of Rome having a singular inheritance, that's at the beginning of the first letter that we're discussing, JE 2448. That's lacking in the Greek. And that passage with the Collectio Britannica has no signs of retroversion. It was never in the Greek. It's impossible. And it's quite strange that while Anastasius admits that the longer ending was in the Greek, he makes no comment of this earlier section, which we could just take Anastasius and trust him and be like, well, he just didn't notify us that he was restoring the original Latin here. Or it's also possible, as I argue, it's because it's an interpolation. Why? What's the evidence of this? Well, this ties into Erick's reading of the ending, the shorter ending, by the way. That's what he was reading with the Greek translation of that first letter. That inheritance from Saints Peter and Paul. We have, I would say, moral certainty that the Greek rendering, as compared to that Latin interpolation earlier in the letter, is correct because it also makes reference Saints Peter and Paul. And likewise, when it quotes that, when it quotes the life of Saint Sylvester, who appears there? Saints Peter and Paul. So it makes no sense to be building up to the point and then showing a demonstration of the point from the life of Saint Sylvester with both Peter and Paul, but both Peter and Paul aren't there earlier in the sentence. The Greek is much more cogent than the Latin. Here's another proof. Now, Erick was interpreting that the end of that shorter ending of that first letter was about the inheritance from Saints Peter and Paul of solely the Bishop of Rome. But if we recognize, no, this connects to the earlier part of the letter about the life of Saint Sylvester, about Pope Saints Peter and Paul, we realize there's that earlier section actually gives us the interpretation. All right, and I'm going to read it. I have, because I don't have my books in my library here in Cambodia. This is Mendham's translation on page 49. Okay, so people could Google.
You want me to pull it up and share it?
You could. And so I'm just going to look what I have here, and if Erick could share it, great. So, and I appreciate.
Yeah, if you want to just get, if you're able to give me the link, or do you have a link to it?
I mean, I do.
Did someone mention another stream? I was
No,
gone for a second.
No,
Somebody
I
said
got it up. Just tell me what page it is.
So page 49, you just scroll down. It starts at the indexes and the prologue.
Yeah.
But okay, on page 49, you can just kind of go to the middle, where it says that now these same holy and chief apostles who laid the foundation of the Catholic and Orthodox faith have left a written law, right? With this exact same thing the letter ends with, by the way, right? It's the same exact idea. So we could tell they're connecting with one another. That all who ever should succeed to their thrones should maintain the same faith and should continue in it even unto the end. And thus it is that our church maintains and honors holy images, right? So we see that all they succeed to their thrones pertains to the whole church, which is why he introduces afterwards our church, why Rome follows this example. And then what follows after that is a reading from the life of Saint Sylvester. Now, to connect back to what Erick was talking about in the ending of the shorter ending of this letter, it quotes Matthew 16:18 as the basis of the binding and loosing and the authority of this teaching. Well, this is relevant because we could see this conflation that all seats of the thrones is about all the bishops. Well, we say, well, Matthew 16:18 is about the Roman church, not about the whole church. But that's not the understanding of Nicaea too. Now, if we have the translation up, it might be a little harder to find because it's less of the page, but it's in page 406. This is the 6th session of the council. During the 6th session of the council, they give the response to the Council of Hiera. So they quote Hiera's decree and then they refute Hiera's decree. It's sort of like a crypto decree of sorts because the council's giving an opinion as to what they really feel in response to a false council. So they quote Matthew 16:18. It says on page 406 in the 6th session, I would they have had taken into consideration the word which the Lord said to Peter, the chief of the apostles, Thou art Peter, and on this rock will I build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. But having no part with the erection of this building, they bubble out things worthy of derision, defining thus. Then they quote Hiera's depositions of clergy. Now they say, having slandered the whole church of God, and not satisfied with this, or yet satiated with impiety, contrary to all law and justice, they go on to determine that no one after this shall dare to make any image whatever. So we can see their argument here, to distill it, is that the church, quoting Matthew 16:18, the whole church is preserved from error. And this is what invalidates Hiera's depositions of clergy throughout the church. We also see, and I don't have the page number handy because again, I'm in Cambodia, but I could put it in the comment section if people are sufficiently bothered or want to follow up. It's also in my book and article. That JE 2449, all right, the letter from from Hadrian to Tarasius, the one that supposedly speaks of supremacy according to Father Richard Price, which it doesn't. That same letter actually gives an interpretation, Matthew 16:18, that also is universalized. And so we could see the connections of not only how Nicaea II interpreted Matthew 16:18, but how Pope Hadrian himself, at least to the council and official business. I'm sure someone could dig up a Latin document in a local Western context that might be just about Rome. But in this conciliar context, the Matthew 16:18 isn't exclusive about Rome. And so when we put all those dominoes on the board, as Erick likes to say, the dominoes show that those who inherit the thrones of Saints Peter and Paul are all the bishops. That's the point. And so now it makes sense, being that we have documentary proof and interpolation, the inconsistency of the life of Saint Sylvester, the lack of proof of any sort of retroversion which would authenticate it, why Anastasius would alter this passage. Because it proves against what he was trying to prove with the supposed singular inheritance of Rome. We could see that this idea that Saints Peter and Paul will extend their shields over the empire, right? That this is something because all the bishops are Pauline and Petrine. This does not mean, of course, that Rome doesn't find themselves to be the head. This is something that's filed away in the Council of Chalcedon. The word head is, and also father, by the way, is used about Rome from the letter of the council to Pope Leo. Why is this relevant? Because in the second letter, Pope Hadrian to Tarasius, it does speak of Rome having, and I think this would be an accurate translation, even from the Greek, ever having the primacy. But the issue is this is not something that would have been controversial or opposed during the Seventh Council. They had canons on this question. Third Council of Constantinople I, Canon 28 of Chalcedon. This would not have been a concession to them as compared to the St. Peter Paul or St. Peter in isolation being a singular honor to Rome, because they likewise saw themselves as inheritors of their thrones. So this is why it's so important to realize that what we see in the second letter wouldn't have required interpolation or excision. While the first letter does have very different teachings that we don't find in any other councils. Right? I just said I could find stuff in Chalcedon that's in the second letter. We can't find anything in any pre-Anastasian document from those interpolations in the first letter. Now, there's other things, because we mentioned interpolations, which are relevant. In the longer ending the first letter, it mentions the title of ecumenical patriarch and like how it can't possibly ever exist. It shouldn't be used. And the only thing I'd add to this is throughout the minutes in Nicaea too, the Tarasius is called ecumenical patriarch. So it's a very odd argument to make, while the rest of the council has no issue with the title ecumenical patriarch. It makes sense, right? That the longer ending, with which I do think authentically has some dispute with ecumenical patriarch, would have this excised. Not ecumenical patriarch, but the consecration rather. That makes sense. It doesn't make sense that this thing about ecumenical patriarch would be there, but this whole idea, both by Rome's legates and it's both in the Latin and the Greek, that it would just be used and no one would think anything of it. There's other identifiable fingerprints of forgery. This is very important. It's hard to understand because people have this sort of elementary school understanding of forgeries. The donation of Constantine, despite Orthodox apologetic videos on this topic, is really not all that important, as I think Erick rightfully points out with our canon stuff, to the question of dispute between us and Roman Catholics. The donation of Constantine essentially speaks of the same headship of Rome and patriarchal appeals to Rome. This is not something that would have been foreign to the pre-schism church. I deal with this in my book, and really, for the sake of our debate, it doesn't get into any of the papal supremacist distinctives, unlike the interpolations, which would be relevant to the dispute. And so, for that reason, when I talk about a forgery, even a crass forgery, like the donation of Constantine, where the whole thing's made up, really isn't too relevant. If you're wondering why they even made it, it had nothing to do with disputes with the East. It had to do with disputes with the Franks, and so that the Romans could have political independence. They were looking for essentially written law that justified Vatican states being their own country. Anyone who reads that document cannot but walk away with that's the actual point of the document. That being said, though, there are identifiable fingerprints of forgery because in the longer ending of this first letter, this letter to the emperors, it contains unattested to, uncited quotations of papal correspondence. You go, well, why is that even relevant? For one, that doesn't exist in the whole entirety of the rest of the letter, only in the sections which does so happen to have unprecedented papal claims. So that's already domino number one, where we have something that textually doesn't exist anywhere in the letter. And anyone can read Lambert's critical edition and go through the rest of the letter, and we don't have unattested papal correspondence. And the rest of the letter, if you want to quibble, there's something the Council of Rome 769, but we're going to leave that aside for now. Doesn't exist in the rest of the letter. The second thing is, this is not the first forgery to use that method. The first forgery was made in the year 847, which would have been about 13 years before Anastasius written career in Rome began in earnest. And that's in the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. In fact, that is the whole methodology behind the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. That's why they escaped detection for like 800 years. Because they sound like papal correspondence. Anyone who's read enough documents that are ecclesiastical know they have a certain sound. They have a certain internal logic. And so when making a forgery, if you make the donation to Constantine, it just sounds like a forgery. It doesn't sound like any donation or any ecclesiastical document from the era. But this is not true of the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. Why? Because they'll take something either that's real, quote it in full, and interpolate it as what happens in Nicaea 2 in the early section, without the retroversion like we talked about. Or they'll make something out of full cloth, but it's like a mosaic made of tiles. They're taking a quote from here, from this document, from, let's say, the Council of Nicaea, and a quote from here, from a letter of Pope Gregory the Great, and a quote from here, from a letter of the emperor to Pope Leo II, or whatever. And they make a whole new idea with the real words of different letters, like different tiles making a mosaic. This is an identifiable methodology that is persistent throughout the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. This methodology is in the longer ending of the first letter to the emperors of Pope Hadrian. Remember, this methodology or anything consistent with it, uncited papal quotations making pro-papal statements, is absent from the rest of the letter. But it just so happens 4 times to exist in the end of the letter. Sentences one after one another, just like the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, which just so happens were made 13 years before Anastasius started writing this stuff. So it's not a coincidence. It's a contemporary method of forgery identifiable in the Latin minutes of Nicaea 2. And so not only do we have 0 signs of retroversion, we have the actual fingerprints of forgery consistent with contemporary forgeries and the best example of contemporary forgeries, Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. This is not something people could have concluded a few years ago, because the research of Chrysos and his name, he's an American, he lives in Germany, his name's skipping me for the moment. He's a big expert in the Pseudo-Isidorians. These guys only start publishing on this topic since 2018. So Erick and I were doing apologetics and reading into this stuff when this stuff wasn't figured out yet. But now it is. And so now we have to update how we understand these documents in light of the evidence. So in light of all this, we have very compelling evidence. We have, one, moral certainty that there's no retroversion. It wasn't in the Greek. But on top of this, very compelling evidence of obvious interpolations. These interpolations containing qualitative statements of papal supremacy absent in pre-Anastasian documents, including that second letter to Tarasius from Pope Hadrian. These details are very important because I understand someone like Erick, who's a Roman Catholic, they see something about the Pope, honorific, about embracing the Vicar. And they, to quote Erick, what may jump to, well, that means it's through the Vicar, through that Vicar. But that's actually not what it states. It's about embracing the Vicar and the thrones and the blessings of Saints Peter and Paul, if I remember right. And so it's about all their successors. So we embrace one successor, St. Peter and Paul, but it's through all the successors, which the religion, the divine religion of the ecumenical councils is being preserved. And so I hope what I offered here, though detailed, I'll sum up, holistically shows what's going on in Nicaea 2. We know earlier in the letter, it applies the thrones of Saints Peter and Paul to all the bishops because it's contrasted with the Church of Rome. So it's not just the Church of Rome. They're also among these churches. It crosses with the interpretation Matthew 16:18 in Hadrian's other letter and in the succession of the council. The supremacy statements are all from passages that have obvious evidence of interpolations. So to me, this is pretty settled. And this is why I've published on this. And so hopefully this is something if people want to get more of, they could follow up. They could read it in the book. It's in a lot of it's in footnotes and future in an article.
All right. Awesome. Erick, you have a response to that? And then we'll do Q&A.
Yeah, I'll try to be really quick. I'll try to be really quick.
Oh, no.
Okay. So if you could just share my screen so that way we have this, up here. Let me go from the current slide. So for those of you who know Greek, I would recommend you go to the actual full Greek, that you can find in Manzi. I actually don't have the reference, unfortunately, right now with me, but I'll try to put that in the comments section for those of you Greek readers. If you kind of want to see what the Greek version of Hadrian's letter actually says, and see whether Mendem's translation is very literal and accurate or not. I consulted an Eastern Orthodox Greek speaker, and and not just one. I consulted another Greek speaker, and I also consulted people who are in the scholarship of translating classical Greek to get this English translation of that last part of the letter, which it does sound different than Mendem's English translation. So you can hit pause here, and then or look to the comments later so you can see the context of the Greek. But I'll just go back to what I was saying here, and I know this is where it's kind of like you got to zoom in a little bit, but if you can, I think it's very important to see that Hadrian in the Greek version, this is an English translation of the Greek here. He's got a consistent reference to the Roman Church as the Church of Peter and Paul. So, and that is a singular reference to Rome. I don't know any commentator who reading this would say that it's referring to the universal church of Peter and Paul. It's referring to the local Roman church of Peter and Paul, the chief of the apostles. And then it refers to, Hadrian's telling Irene and Constantine that if they restore image veneration, which was on the down in Byzantium, if they restore it, then they're opening themselves up to conformity with the Roman Church. And when you do that, the Roman Church, being the Church of Peter and Paul, then brings certain benefits to you. And then it says, look in the middle there, if you follow the tradition of the Orthodox faith of the Church of the Holy Peter and Paul, which is a reference to Rome, and embrace their vicar. Again, it's important to understand when he says vicar there, we got to pause. Okay. Vicar is in the singular, not vicars, because if it said vicars, that can't refer to one person, but because he's referring to vicar, he sees Peter and Paul. In other words, he sees the Roman bishop as an individual, as the vicar of Peter and Paul. And what's a vicar? A vicar is somebody who stands in place of another. So he's saying the Roman pontiff stands in the place of Peter and Paul. And what's the consequence of that? Is that just a name? No, it's because the powers that were given to Peter and Paul are now active in their vicar, who's the Roman pontiff. And it's important to understand that because later, when he starts to refer to their, in the Greek, let's see, it's their didoxus, right here, their didoxus, their successors. There's really no good reason, in my opinion, to take this to mean to the whole hierarchy of the whole universal church. Because the context here is Hadrian telling Irene and Constantine to conform themselves to the tradition of Rome, which is the church of Peter and Paul. And if you embrace their vicar, in other words, if you embrace me, Pope Hadrian, then you get the benefit of having the power that Christ gave to them in the person of their vicar. And so just shortly after that, it speaks about the successors of Peter and Paul. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the vicar that will last until the end of time. So some people might say, he says successors, Erick, that's plural. That's got to be referring to Rome, the patriarchs, the rest of the bishops. But again, remember, this passage, he's talking about the historical longevity of history until the end of time. Of course, there's going to be more than one Roman pontiff, right? So he's talking. So I interpreted this. This is why I come to a different. So for the listeners, to make this easier, this is why I come to a different understanding than Craig does, because he's seeing this as a general application to the Bishop of Ephesus, the Bishop of Corinth, the Bishop of Asia, everywhere. And in the context, this is talking, and I take it as a reference to the Roman pontiff, because that's the context. It's talking about the benefits that Constantinople is going to open themselves up to if they conform to the Roman pontiff. Do you see? The other thing I wanted to say was Peter and Paul. Some people might say, well, Erick, it says Peter and Paul. Therefore, Vatican I's flushed down the toilet, right? Well, maybe Vatican I is flushed down the toilet. I don't think it is, but it's still saying the chief of the apostles gives something to the Roman Church itself. So, and the Roman Catholic Church continued to refer to Peter and Paul. Read the correspondence of Pope Gregory VII. Nobody questions, nobody in scholarship questions that Pope Gregory VII was a papal supremacist. Well, then when he refers to the authority of Peter and Paul, does that mean that he didn't believe, he wasn't a papal supremacist? Or how about popes later on, like Pope Leo X in his bull condemning Martin Luther, refers to the authority of Peter and Paul? So does that mean he's deleting his understanding of what became clear by the 16th century? So it's not necessary. It's not necessary for us to say, oh, the addition of Paul there definitely depletes this of a strong papal claim. The other thing is the whole church, Matthew 16. My interpretation of Matthew 16, ecclesia, is the whole church. It's never the Roman church. In fact, the only person I know of who makes use of Matthew 16 to refer to the Roman church is Maximus the Confessor. And his reduction there is actually, it doesn't match well with popes in the 13th, 14th. Vatican I does not make a reference, it does not interpret it as the local Roman church. It's always the universal church. You know. And then the last thing I want to, Saint Tarasius mentions that Rome in the Acts of Nicaea 787, Tarasius says elsewhere that the Roman bishop inherits the presidency over the whole hierarchy of the church because of its Petrine succession. And so the council did welcome the claim. Now, did they understand it in an Orthodox Byzantine way? Probably. But they understood it. They didn't have a problem speaking about Peter alone. The last thing I want to say is that the Greek version of the letter to Tarasius, we will just have to disagree on that. I do think that it has claims to, maybe, again, Vatican I's not really in my purview here. It makes claims that move the needle far away from contemporary Orthodox beliefs. That's all I'm trying to say. Whether does that bring us to Catholicism? I don't know. I think it does, but I'm not here to really show that. It does. I don't think that it matches Eastern Orthodoxy, which is a different it's a different intention. I could be an atheist, I could be a Buddhist, and have that goal in mind. And then the very last thing I want to say is that the donation of Constantine does have a reference to Peter alone, and how the Roman bishop is his vicar, the vicar of Peter, in addition to several other secular endorsements. Yeah, so that's basically it. Sorry about that. It took a little time.
I mean,
Nope.
I just want to say very briefly, I don't have too much to say in response to that, but I think, in summary, I think what we're seeing is, if we're looking at where the needle's moving, it's absolutely moving away from Rome. You know, with what we're finding with the forgeries and interpolations, what we're finding with aspects missing in the Greek, but there in the Latin, the needle's moving the other way. And so I think, following the evidence, what we're finding is the Orthodox position being vindicated from history, and the Orthodox position being extant and explicit in the sources that are reliable, but absent from those the papal claims that we have today, absent from those. But the quibble one thing, like when we talk about Matthew 16, its application to the church, because its application is specific to the Church of Rome, and Anastasius' interpolation early in the letter, is the term of vicar, which clearly is used there for the Church of Rome. But when the passage continues, it speaks of thrones, right? Cathedrals, almost, one could say. And we're talking about more than one church now. There, one bishop doesn't have multiple thrones. And so it's not like, oh, well, Saints Peter and Paul, or, you know, we focus on other plurals. The issue is the term thrones. And as we see that application with other usages in the council and by Hadrian himself in Matthew 16:18, particularly the contrast between the thrones and the Church of Rome, we could see he's using it in the sense that the thrones are the whole church, and Rome is amongst those churches, another church. Now, I think people here, you know, they could be sympathetic to Erick's interpretation that he sees within the ending. If we parse it grammatically a certain way and bring in an interpretation that I don't think holistically takes sense to the rest of the council, but let's say it's just grammatically more compelling if we want to concede that for the sake of argument. I think it really begs the question, what then motivates the interpolations of Anastasius to make it so specific about the singular honor of Rome? If what we already had there in the Greek could be taken in that sense, why alter it so it absolutely must be taken to that sense? I do think, if we're just going to go by, you know, what's more credible, it's when I'm posing the interpretation I give explicit in the sources, that now we see a clear motivation for the alteration in the interpolation, because what we do have actually disputes the Roman Catholic view that we have today, which Anastasius introduced into the text. And so I do think the interpolation is not a matter of, oh, well, it says the same thing. No, the interpolation was added specifically because the person making it knew it didn't say the same thing. Otherwise, what would his motive be to add interpolation that would say the same thing with different words? I just don't think that's very credible. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I disagree, but I totally respect your work. You know, what you're doing here is you're in the trenches. We come to a different conclusion, but you know, I respect your investigation.
Thank you, Erick.
Yeah. All right. Q&A time. Thank you guys for that conversation. I feel like all the internet theology conversation should be like this. I wish they were all like this. All the guys watching, take notes, learn how to talk about theology with each other. This is how you do it. Okay, first question comes from Dioscoros to Erick. Does the Jansenist controversy show that Rome is infallible on matters of fact directly related, like the Augustinus containing X heresies, Ibas letter with Vigilius in mind. Before you answer, Eric, I just want to say real quick, you mentioned about Peter and Paul always being mentioned together. In our diptychs in the Syriac church, we say Risha Dishlihe, the head of the singular head, the head of the apostles, or Risha can be translated as prince, but it's still singular, prince or head of the apostles, Peter and Paul. We say a singular noun, and then we give both names.
Yeah,
which is I think very interesting.
Yeah. So Dioscorus, this is something that is in my stack. I've got a large stack of things to really tackle. So what I'm about to say here is actually scratching at my memory for what we're talking about. I know the Jansenist controversy and either the 5 books or the 5 arguments in Jansenist's book was condemned, and then the Jansenists said, well, we agree with the Pope's rationale, but we don't agree that it hit the target with what Jansenist actually said. And then the response to that was, no, the Pope's referent is included in his infallible authority. When I did some research in this a few years ago, I had some Catholic theologians tell me yes and no. So I still don't really know. I could tell you this: if our doctrine of papal infallibility implies that factual terms, like whether Ibas's letter was Nestorian or Cyrillian, if that is consubstantial with the infallibility of the Pope in his ex cathedra decrees,
no pun intended.
And if the first constitution is an ex cathedra decree, then I think we have found a falsification for papal infallibility in Vigilius. So that's it's a pending research on my part. So I'm still doing my homework.
Thanks as always for your honesty, Eric. Okay. Next question. This one's for me. To what extent does the Petrine See, quotes, refer to Rome, Alexandria, Antioch collectively rather than exclusively to Old Rome? Depends on the context. So how do we know which Petrine See it's referring to? It could refer to a particular one, or it could refer to in the general sees of Peter. Craig mentioned earlier that he read our canons. So in our canons, you will see a reference where the Patriarch of Antioch on multiple occasions appeals to his Petrine authority. One off the top of my head is if anybody looks into the IOC controversy, which is the schismatic Indian group that schismed from Antioch. We have Indians in communion with Antioch and Indians excommunicated from Antioch. And ironically, a lot of the arguments made are Petrine arguments, and the Indians under Antioch say they call themselves under the Holy Throne. Okay, so and when the bull of excommunication went forth, in the letter is all this Petrine language of why Antioch has the authority to do such a thing. So in that case, it would be particularly to the See of Antioch. You'll see in other cases in church history where the Petrine See could refer to Rome particularly, or to Alexandria, or to all three in a general sense. It just depends on the literature that you're reading. This is for both of you guys. Does John IV of Jerusalem's Roman pontiff inerrancy statement in the 570s to the 90s serve as a prelude to how Agatho Hadrian thought about their writings and stuff?
I would need the statement in front of me. I've seen stuff cited even in footnotes, and when you follow up, it's just not there. So it's. I will say this as a general rule, though. Whether it's Filioque, whether it's papacy, whether it's energy essence distinction, doesn't matter. You have a quote mine, or you see a quote, or someone provides you the quote, and you go, all right, I see what the quote says. Could you tell me what was it talking about before and what was it talking about after the quote? And the person says, well, I don't know. Then they don't know the context of the quote, and you really can't interpret it. And so I do think that in this instance, I would have to read the letter or read the section and really know what's going on here. I don't know.
You're on mute, Eric.
Okay, sorry about that. So this is another thing I've looked at without getting the original. I tried to hunt it down years ago, and I think I got sent a document like about a year ago, and I saved it, but I didn't read it. I don't know. I don't know. What I can tell you is this, and it's relevant to the Pope Sylvester, is that there's actually only one place that I know of, and if anybody here or in the comments section knows of another place, you could just say it in the comments. I know of only one place in the entire Byzantine Meneon, the festival feasts of the saints, where it says that somebody teaches infallibly. And it's actually in January 2nd, Pope Sylvester, his office in the Byzantine Meneon. And through some scholarship that's being done by Father Christian Capps, it's not published yet. There is a claim that St. John the hymnographer, who's a saint in both Catholic and Orthodox churches, was actually influenced by Anastasius Bibliothecarius, the librarian, when they met together at the Council of 869. And that because of Pope Nicholas's usage of Actus Sylvestri in his claim to immunity of judgment and other statements from the Acts of Sylvester, a Council of Rome in 324, and a few other things, it's thought that maybe St. John Hymnographer actually created the office for Pope Sylvester in 869 and included that in there as a result of an assumed authenticity to the Actus Sylvestri. That's something that's kind of speculative, it seems to me, but maybe once things are published, it'll come out looking more pristine. But directly to your question, I don't know.
Yeah, the Oscars, send it over through Subdeacon Daniel. When it comes to Arminian manuscripts, a lot of Arminians were in communion of Rome, so it depends on dating, where it comes from. So there's textual critical things that are relevant to questions like this. And yeah, the question of him and the Menaean, the timing would be interesting because in reality, the Council of Constantinople 869-870, in some respects, adds additional difficulties to the idea of papal infallibility. And it's something that Anastasius, only a few years later, really clarified on that subject of Honorius and everything. So the timing would be interesting to me. And so, like Eric said, we really have to see everything that comes out on this and how it's interpreted in order to really draw strong conclusions about it.
All right. Next question. Could Craig and Eric go over their positions on Stephen of Bosra and Pope Hadrian on whether statues are idols? I started this debate years ago when I asked Eric about Craig's claim. You guys disagree on this point with each other?
I mean, Eric just had a large article, which I haven't read, and I haven't looked in this topic for years now. So I'm not sure what the debate is.
Well, so that's, yeah, my article, I open up saying I'm not sure if Craig would hold to this anymore, but I remember in the past there being an appeal to the work of what's Petavius, Cardinal Petavius, uh, who was used by another French scholar of the 16th century, Bingham, who Mendham cites or refers to in his translation of the Acts, where Hadrian uses Stephen of Bostra and says there's a difference between an image and a statue that is an idol. And the idea was, look at there. There's an equation being made between a statue and an idol, and I think that Mendham, trying to summarize Bingham and Petavius, said that there were some commentaries from Gregory of Constantinople and Stephen of Bostra, saying that the early church didn't use statues because of how close they looked to early statuary idols. And so I thought that you were saying that therefore Pope Hadrian condemns the use of statues, but the way I read it is very different, because he goes on to speak about 3D images, and the whole council goes on to refer to, and I know you already know this, so I'm not saying this as if you don't know this, but the woman who made a statue of Jesus in
Venice.
There you go. So that was recorded. That's used by John Malalas, John of Damascus, and then it's used by the Seventh Council. So it seems as though statuary itself is not idolatry, but rather statuary with the intention of using it in correspondence to an idol is what's idolatry. That was my position. That's the whole article.
Yeah, this is one of those examples where if we had a stubborn-minded, single-minded, one bishop says one thing, and so if any other bishop ever disagrees with that bishop in a council, then it puts itself into like internal contradiction. I think this would be an example that would create that issue, because all we have from what is quoted by Pope Hadrian is a negative, idolatrous evaluation of statues. That being said, that is not the firm conclusion of the council. And I've been talking about this for years. The council holds statues in tension. So it comes up later in the council, the existence of doves, for example, representing the Holy Spirit. It doesn't really endorse it per se. It simply, mentions their existence and stuff like that. And so it kind of reminds me something that comes up in the 5th session of the 5th Ecumenical Council, where, and I think this was, who was the Bishop of Constantinople in that council?
Nicaea?
I'm sorry?
In Nicaea?
No, in Constantinople too. Anyway, he writes in that
Eutychius.
Okay, yeah, Eutychius writes in the 5th session, or says, because they're writing what he says, that the council doesn't follow, and this is in the letter of Ibus to Maris, the opinion of one or two bishops in its evaluation. So the point of this observation of his was, even if one or two bishops in the council approved of the Nestorian contents of the supposed letter of Ibus to Maris, that does not mean that was the mind of the Chalcedonian fathers, which makes sense because we have all the subscriptions. Only one or two say anything that may, and Subdeacon and I have had videos on this, that may be construed in the sense that they approved of Nestorianism. And so if we apply that principle, even if, which I do believe textually the answer is yes, St. Agatho condemned statues. That clearly isn't the entire mindset of the council. It doesn't endorse statues. They're not endorsed the conciliar decree. Their depiction is not endorsed. The decree endorses icons of Christ and the saints and angels, which is interesting, not of the Holy Spirit. Even though icons of the Holy Spirit are mentioned, his depictions are not decreed, because similar to those statues, it seems like the council didn't have a single teaching on it. That was held in tension. And so that's my best understanding of that topic, having not really visited that in much detail in 4 years or so. But that's what I remember right now.
Okay. So I sent over the John the Fourth thing from Dioscoros to you guys on Facebook. Whenever
Good
you guys
vacation reading. Good vacation reading.
All right. So next question. Could let's see. So we did that one just now. Okay. This is to you, Craig. Can Craig provide a concentrated summary of how he addresses the stronger papal language in Agatho and Hadrian? He appears to suggest they were later interpolations. That's your thesis, huh?
Not quite.
Oh.
Very distinct. There was not an interpolation. Agatho's letter does not contain interpolations.
Okay.
I put forward that Agatho's letter contains the sort of honorifics and content typical of other 7th century documents, and that the council, in removing a section from that letter, did so in order to prevent confusion with other conciliar business. If Honorius, for whatever reason, wasn't anathematized, I don't think they would have. I don't see the reason to. This is very different from Nicaea II, where what we have in the interpolations have explicitly and specifically different content that is lacking in any church documents preceding the 9th century. So that would be a distillation of what I'm expounding here.
All right. Last question. I'm gonna wrap it up. Erick, which conciliar act decree has greater magisterial weight, the anathema of Honorius for heresy or Agatho's letter?
Yeah, so Agatho's letter was accepted by the council, so it's got a great deal of weight. And Leo II, when he ratified the council, he made reference to Agatho's letter, as the voice of Peter and all that kind of thing. So Agatho's letter was not directly, nobody quibbled with it as far as we know at the council. All right, I know there's some disagreements about that, but nothing at the council is said, and nothing in the posterior history indicates that, in my understanding. So what has greater magisterial weight? Well, in Catholic ecclesiology, the anathema of a person, it's a matter of debate in Catholicism as to whether this can be understood as fallible. I don't think it's ever been treated magisterially. For example, we believe that canonizations are infallible. So when somebody's canonized, we believe that the infallibility of the church is employed when such a thing happens. So it's a good question to ask. Okay, well, if canonizations are infallible, then why wouldn't anathematizations be infallible? To be honest with you, I can't speak on behalf of Catholicism. I can tell you that the Byzantines did believe they were infallible. Perhaps not every single last one of them, but that seems to be the overriding consensus. Anastasius, the librarian, he seems to think that it's not infallible, because in one of his writings, he says that the council erred and that we should go with another opinion about Honorius. Yeah, so I mean, what has greater magisterial weight? I would say, if I had to choose one, it would be Agatho's letter. But here's the issue: Pope Leo II agreed with the anathematization of Honorius. So there's at least some part of Agatho's letter that remains in conflict with what his successor decreed. So you have a pope against a pope on a matter of fact, namely Honorius's judgment, his failure at defending the truth.
Right.
I would say that's an observation. The weighting of magisterial authorities. I'm honestly unaware of anyone else who have parsed it like that before Anastasius. So that is a something I think important, because it comes up again and again in our discourse, and that's why I think people ought not be laughing about what I'm putting forward about Anastasius. This is pretty serious stuff, and I think with further research, it's going to be vindicated by history.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys again. I really appreciated you guys coming on for this, and like I said, viewers, their channels and the links to their books are in the description, so check them out. Look out for future content from both of them regarding this topic and other topics, and like, subscribe, do all that stuff that people say to do, comment, whatever. And if you guys have any plugs or whatever, go for it. Erick, Craig.
Get both of our books.
Yep, get both our books. And being that I'm in Cambodia and I'm helping with the mission here, orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, support the evangelism here in Cambodia.
And then give us that verse.
Funny story though. An inquirer came in with him and his wife and a daughter, and talked a little bit and whatnot. And then my wife starts talking to the wife. It's like, she's my cousin. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, it's her first cousin.
Oh wow!
So random. I thought that was pretty interesting. Her first cousin walked into the door of a Orthodox church.
Yeah, it's awesome.
There you
go. Give us the verse you always close with, Craig.
Fight to death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a good day.
I mean.
على صداي ونقطي موت